I want to tell you about the time I joined a fitness class and found a community, though calling it a community might be misleading, considering the events that transpired. It all started when I resolved to kick my sedentary lifestyle in the new year. The resolution wasn't just for my health, it was a desperate plea to feel alive again. I stumbled upon a high-intensity interval training class at a local gym. The reviews were glowing, people raved about the instructors, and the overall atmosphere seemed vibrant and encouraging. I signed up on a whim, fueled by a desire to transform myself and perhaps meet new friends. On the first day, I pushed open the glass door, and a bell chimed as I stepped inside. The smell of sweat and determination filled the air, mingled with a hint of something metallic that I couldn't quite place. A tall woman with arms like carved marble invited me to join the class, her voice booming yet warm. She introduced herself as Coach Lisa and the other participants followed suit, each more welcoming than the last. I felt a flicker of hope as I joined the group, mostly people in their late 20s to early 40s, with smiles hinting at camaraderie. As the class kicked off, I struggled to keep up, my muscles screaming as I pushed through squats and burpees. But the atmosphere was infectious. Each participant cheered for one another, offering high fives and laughter, even when someone fell behind. There was a camaraderie that was hard to ignore, an unspoken bond forming between us. Week after week, I returned, slowly building my strength and discovering a rhythm I never knew I had. There was a beauty to the struggle. I started to connect with the people in the class. We shared our stories, our fears, and our victories, forging something deeper than just an exercise bond. It became a sanctuary after the chaos of the outside world. This was more than fitness, it was a community. But then, about a month in, things began to change. Coach Lisa, who had been our enthusiastic cheerleader, started pushing us harder, demanding more and more each session. At first, we welcomed the challenge. After all, growth comes from discomfort, right? But I noticed something off, a twitch in her eye, a serrated edge to her encouragement that sent chills down my spine. During one class, someone collapsed, gasping for air. I rushed over, and Coach Lisa ordered us to keep going, her voice cutting through the commotion like a knife. Confusion engulfed the room until the paramedics arrived, and the shrill sirens filled the air. The woman who collapsed, easily in her 30s, was taken away. The rest of us filed outside, shaken, uncertain about the day's events. I drove home, processing my thoughts, but the sense of unease lingered like a shadow. When class resumed, I could feel a shift in the atmosphere. Conversations turned quiet, laughter faded, and each of us carried the weight of that day with us. It wasn't just a fitness class anymore, it felt like we had become part of something darker, the camaraderie giving way to anxiety. Despite this, each of us returned. Surprisingly, we were drawn back into the cycle, our minds whispering that if we pushed harder, we'd find the community we had once cherished. One evening, I overheard two classmates speaking in hushed tones. They mentioned strange symbols that Coach Lisa often drew when we suffered through particularly grueling workouts. My heart raced. I hadn't noticed these markings before, but now they felt like they were etched into my memory. Upon further investigation, I discovered online forums filled with stories of other fitness classes that had devolved into cult-like structures, with instructors who manipulated their followers into extreme dedication. In a fit of despair, I rewatched old footage from our sessions, and what I saw was chilling. Behind the smiles, there was a growing intensity in Lisa's gaze, a predatory energy that thrived on our exhaustion. One Saturday evening, we had a workout scheduled that was reportedly a culmination session whatever that meant. I arrived, but when I opened the door, the atmosphere was thick with tension. No one spoke, and the lights dimmed, casting strange shadows across the room. As we lined up, Lisa entered, and her demeanor had shifted, more erratic and frenzied than ever before. I felt a desire to leave but was frozen in place, unable to move. She began chanting, drawing those symbols in the air with her fingers, an incantation that felt alien yet alluring. The room pulsed, breathing together as if we were part of something bigger, something cosmic. Despite my instincts screaming to flee, I couldn't shake the feeling of belonging, that perhaps this was where I was meant to be, pulled in by that magnetic force. It all unraveled in a cacophony of voices, as we entered a trance-like state, moving rhythmically, endlessly, our bodies dripping with sweat as we surrendered ourselves to what Lisa demanded. I could feel the collective exhilaration, but beneath it was a dread that gnawed at my gut. Just as I thought I might lose myself entirely, a loud crash broke the tension, a window shattered, and a figure rushed inside. It was Eric, one of our more rational members, eyes wild with fear. "Get out," he shouted, but before he could reach me, two others seized him and dragged him away, their eyes glazed, lost to the haze of the class. Panic surged through me, and with every ounce of strength, I bolted for the door, navigating through the confusion as bodies twitched and swayed. I sprinted into the night, and as I looked back, I saw the group converging around Lisa, calling out her name, their voices merging into a chorus of chants. The relief of cold air hit me hard as I stumbled into my car. I drove off, heart racing, desperate to distance myself from that nightmare that had masqueraded as a community. Weeks went by without contact. I found another gym and resumed my normal life, but I could still hear their chants echoing in my mind. I wondered what had happened to those men and women I'd shared laughter and sweat with, and whether any of them had managed to escape. I later heard whispers about Lisa, how she had vanished, taking her followers with her to an unnamed location. Those who sought to leave reportedly met disturbing ends, as if the ties that bound them were stronger than their will to break free. I shuddered at the thought of it all, my heart heavy with guilt and loss for what we had once shared, a sense of belonging twisted into something insidious. I look at my reflection in the mirror every day, challenging myself to remember what it meant to be part of a community but haunted by the specters of a past I can't escape. I still work out, try out new classes, but each time I walk into a gym, the taste of that metallic fear creeps back in, reminding me that sometimes, the things we join with the best of intentions can lead to places darker than we ever imagined. So please, if you're thinking of trying something new or joining a community, take a step back. Make sure you're stepping into a place built on trust and love, not one that could swallow you whole. I've hesitated to share this story, and now that I'm putting it into words, my fingers tremble as I type. I work as a night shift manager in an old factory that produces a variety of parts for automotive manufacturers, and let me tell you, after dark, this place is haunted, not by ghosts but by something far worse. It started about a month ago. We had a new hire, a guy named Derek. At first, he seemed harmless, a little quiet, maybe even a bit withdrawn, but that didn't raise any red flags at first. What caught my attention was the way he worked. Day in and day out, he would stay focused on the assembly line, not bothering to socialize, not even looking up when I walked by. The rest of the crew would clock out, swap stories, or joke around, but Derek was like a phantom, a shadow wandering through the factory floor, and as days turned into weeks, I noticed things about him that made me uncomfortable. The lights in the factory are dim after hours, flickering occasionally, but every night I'd find Derek pulled away from his station, staring blankly at the darkened corner of the room, as if he were waiting for something. I remember vividly one evening, I approached him because he hadn't moved for what felt like ages, and as I got closer, I noticed a thin layer of sweat on his brow. "Hey, you all right?" I asked, trying to gauge where his mind was. He turned to me, and his eyes were wide, almost feverish, like he was half awake from a nightmare. "Did you hear that?" he asked in a whisper, glancing toward the shadows. "Hear what?" I replied. He shook his head and went back to his work. I shrugged it off, thinking it was typical night shift fatigue. However, things didn't get better. The factory started to feel different, people were on edge, whispering rumors that something lurked in the darkness. I dismissed it as mere superstition until I noticed more peculiar behaviors. One night in particular, during our typical shift review, a couple of employees mentioned the strange noises, rattling, whispers that seemed to echo from the walls, but those were just the shadows playing tricks, I thought. Or maybe Derek was just getting under everyone's skin. I tried to ignore it, but then it escalated. A week later, some machinery malfunctioned. It was a huge deal. In our line of work, machinery mishaps, especially during night shifts, can lead to severe accidents. I was called immediately to the scene, and you won't believe what I saw. When I arrived, the lights were flickering aggressively, and Derek stood alone, somehow managing to look both terrified and entranced. The assembly line had gone haywire, parts scattered everywhere, and I had to scream my orders to get control of the situation before anyone could get hurt. When I finally reached Derek, I shouted, "What happened? Why didn't you call for help?" His eyes were wild. He responded, barely audible, "I can't let it in." I thought he was just panicking, but the way he spoke chilled me to my core. "What do you mean?" I probed, and that's when he let slip that he'd started to hear voices at night, haunting whispers that beckoned him deeper into the factory's labyrinthine recesses. But he wouldn't explain what they wanted. After that night, I should have put my foot down and had him sent home. Instead, I made the mistake of thinking it could be a phase, until it wasn't. The situation continued to decline. Derek began showing up for work wearing odd clothes, layers of thick clothing that didn't match the factory's barren aesthetic, always dark colors that made him look like he was part of the gloom itself. His productivity dropped, and he started lurking in places where nobody should be, behind stacks of crates, next to machinery that had been out of service for years, places where I couldn't see him, where shadows stretched long and distorted. I confronted him one night, demanding he stop hiding and do his job. That's when I received the worst shock of all. He leaned in close, his breath warm yet filled with an odd chill. "You're wrong to be afraid of the dark," he whispered, and in that moment, I felt a flicker of something, an ancient fear that crawled up my spine like icy fingers. I didn't just feel like he was strange, I felt like I was being hunted by something I couldn't perceive. Things moved downhill from there. In the following days, the factory started to come apart at the seams. Tools were missing. Employees refused to work near Derek, and on one particularly disturbing shift, I found one of my best workers, Jenna, huddled on the floor, shaking, mumbling about someone watching her. I called her name, and as she looked up at me, I saw the fear that had overtaken her, her eyes darting around wildly as though something lurked just behind me. It hit me then that whatever was happening wasn't just in Derek's head, it was in all of ours. It escalated quickly from whispered fears to sheer chaos. One night, Derek disappeared entirely. A heavy noise struck the factory, reverberating through the walls, and next thing I knew, he was gone. Panic rippled through the crew as they searched, calling his name into the void that only muffled laughter seemed to answer. Eventually, we found him, burnt and crumpled, in the old machinery storage room, moaning about having seen the bad thing. Behind him, shadows twisted and stretched in ways they shouldn't. I immediately called for help, but deep down, I knew that help wouldn't arrive in time, that darkness, whatever it was becoming more formidable. That night, I made a choice to confront whatever was lurking. Armed with a flashlight and a handful of courage, I ventured back to the area Derek had been found. The air felt electric, and my heart hammered in my chest. I turned the corner, and the light flickered wildly around the room, revealing scraps of machinery and an endless wall of darkness. It seemed to pulse like it was alive, and as I stood there, a voice, smooth and dripping with malice, whispered my name. I froze, paralyzed with fear. "Join us," it said, its tone effervescent, almost seductive. I stumbled back, and the flashlight flickered before going out completely. I flailed, trying to reignite my courage, when I suddenly heard whispers around me, a cacophony of hushed voices echoing through the void, chanting my name. I fled, knocking over a stack of metal scraps as I scrambled to get away, my heart racing, desperately searching for the exit. As I burst out into the main area, I realized the factory was no longer the same, it seemed more alive, almost sentient. Was it the aftermath of Derek's lingering presence or something immeasurably darker? I couldn't tell. The next morning, I reported everything that happened, but nobody believed me. They thought I was suffering burnout, just another casualty of a troubling night shift. But I dealt with a difficult situation at work, and I had to implement my strategy of survival. I quit the job. Every night since then, I dream about that factory, and I think of Derek, and sometimes I hear my name whispered among the shadows. When I lay in bed, I can almost convince myself that I'm safe, but deep down, I know they're still out there, waiting, watching, and who knows how many others will find themselves trapped in their own nightmares. So, if you ever find yourself in a factory that feels a tad too dark, remember my story and don't look too closely into the shadows. You just might discover something looking right back at you. It was a rainy Thursday evening, the kind of day where the sky seemed to weep alongside me as I sat crumpled on my couch, a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey within arm's reach and scrolling through my phone, desperately searching for something to distract me from the hollowness inside. I had reached a point in my life where nothing felt solid, my job at a dead-end retail store was suffocating me, my social life was non-existent, and every dream I had ever harbored felt like it was slipping through my fingers like sand. As I thumbed through photos of friends who had moved on, had families, and were truly living, I felt a familiar pang of jealousy mixed with an overwhelming sense of despair. That's when I came across a post that changed everything. It was a simple image, just a quote that read, "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now." Something about it resonated deep within me, awakening a distant memory of childhood optimism that I'd buried under layers of adult cynicism. The next few hours became a blur of resolve fueled by the last dregs of whiskey in my system. I decided I would change my life. So I made a list, an almost ridiculous list of things I wanted to do: travel to at least 3 countries, learn guitar, reconnect with my estranged brother, go back to school, and, most importantly, confront the growing darkness within me. The following morning I woke up hungover, with my head pounding and the sunlight stabbing through the drawn curtains. As I squinted at my phone, bleary-eyed and filled with regret, I could hardly remember the clarity I'd felt the night before. But my list was still there, staring back at me like a promise I had made to myself. I needed to take the first step, so I grabbed my keys and went out to the only coffee shop I could afford. As I reached the entrance, something unexpected happened. An elderly woman stumbled, and instinctively, I rushed to catch her. Her fall, however, seemed more than just a misstep. She told me she had been having trouble with her balance for some time. I helped her get settled at a table and ordered her a coffee while bringing out my laptop to start a search for guitar lessons. I only wanted to help, but what happened next would haunt me for days to come. The woman struck up a conversation, and as we talked, I found out she had once traveled all over the world, a free spirit who had lived on her terms. The more she shared, the heavier her words weighed on me. Among her myriad stories, she paused and looked me in the eye, asking, "Do you live your life or let life live you?" Just then, a chill raced down my spine. I wanted to laugh off the moment, but something dark inside me remained unsettled. I excused myself to the restroom, splashing cool water on my face. When I returned, I found her gone, her empty cup sitting perfectly on the table as if she had never been there at all. A strange feeling washed over me. I looked at her half-finished coffee, and felt an inexplicable connection to her story, as if she had just tried to impart something crucial. I looked around, but the coffee shop was still crowded. No one seemed to notice my growing anxiety as I sat there staring at the empty seat. Then, I made my decision. I would go after what mattered. I would live deliberately and with purpose. I would confront the parts of my life I had willingly ignored for far too long. Over the next few weeks, I enrolled in a community college class, started guitar lessons, and reached out to my brother after years of silence. We met for coffee, awkward at first, but our shared memories gradually melted the ice that had grown between us. I began feeling lighter, freer. My life did not change overnight, but every small step felt like climbing a mountain, and I was determined to reach the summit. But just as I began to believe in my newfound direction, the darkness I had pushed down for so long began surfacing again. I found myself consumed by self-doubt, questions draping my spirit like a heavy fog. Was this real? Was I truly capable of change? One evening, as I strummed the guitar in my dimly lit living room, I struck a wrong chord, and the sound shattered my newfound tranquility. I snapped the strings of the instrument in a fit of rage, slumping to the floor with my head in my hands. That's when I felt an overwhelming urge to go back to the coffee shop, to find that woman who had been so pivotal in my life, if she even truly existed. I rushed down the street, fighting the rain and a creeping sense of panic. Upon arriving, I practically lunged for the door, breathless and frantic, scanning the tables for her, but the atmosphere was as unyielding as the downpour outside. Then, as if the shop itself sensed my desperation, I turned around to leave, and there she was, sitting by the window, a soft smile crinkling her wrinkles. My heart raced as I approached her table. She looked up and said softly, "You came quickly. I've been waiting for you." I hardly knew how to respond, my mind swimming with unanswered questions, but instead of overwhelming her with words, I opened my heart, recounting everything I had experienced since our last encounter. I expected a lecture, perhaps a small nod of understanding, but her eyes filled with warmth. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper against the clatter of cups and chatter of patrons. "Life will always throw you off course. But remember, it's not just the pursuit of change that's essential, it's understanding who you want to be. You have everything you need within you to build the life you want." It was as if she could see into the darkest corners of my soul, into a place I hadn't dared to reveal, or perhaps I was just projecting my own hopes onto her sage presence. But just as suddenly as she arrived, she finished her coffee, rose, and gave me a nod of encouragement before wandering out the door and disappearing into the rain-soaked street. Suddenly, it struck me. She had never seemed to have a purpose for coming here, yet she had altered my course forever. Perhaps she was merely a spirit of inspiration, a personification of my earlier dreams urging me to break free. I left the coffee shop that night with a burning sense of purpose, ready to face whatever came next. No matter how daunting, I realized that every small change was a step towards something brighter. I would change my life for the better, not just for me, but for everyone who dared to hope, the countless souls who felt lost like I once did. My hands trembled with resolve. I couldn't shake the feeling this was just the beginning, that life would continue revealing wonders to me if I only leaned into it. So here I stand today, sharing this story in hopes of reaching someone like that woman reached me. Whoever you are, at whatever stage of your journey, know this: it's never too late to decide to change your life for the better. And who knows? You may find inspiration where you least expect it. How a random act of kindness changed my outlook on life. It had been one of those weeks that felt like it would never end, a week where every small inconvenience compounded into something bigger, heavier, and harder to shake. My car battery died on Monday, making me late for work, and by the time Friday rolled around, I was facing the very real prospect of having to dip into my savings to cover unexpected repairs. My boss wasn't thrilled with my tardiness, and the tension at work only added to the suffocating weight of everything else. By the time I left the office that evening, I felt like a rubber band stretched too tightly, ready to snap. I stopped at the grocery store on the way home, dragging my feet as I wandered the aisles, barely paying attention to what I was throwing into my cart. My thoughts were a swirling mess of frustration and exhaustion, so much so that I almost didn't notice the woman struggling with her shopping bags near the entrance as I walked out. She was older, probably in her late 70s, with white hair tucked into a bun and a frail frame that looked like it shouldn't be carrying half the load she was attempting to juggle. One of her bags had already split, its contents spilling across the sidewalk, a couple of apples, a loaf of bread, and a jar of peanut butter rolling into the gutter. People walked by without stopping, some glancing at her with mild sympathy before continuing on their way, as if acknowledging her struggle would somehow burden them with the responsibility of helping. I almost kept walking too. Almost. But something in her expression, a mixture of embarrassment and quiet desperation, made me pause. I sighed, already feeling the weight of my own problems pressing down on me, but I couldn't ignore her. I knelt to gather the scattered groceries, scooping up the jar of peanut butter and placing it back into one of her remaining bags. "Let me help you," I said, standing to meet her eyes. She looked surprised, as if she hadn't expected anyone to stop. "Oh, thank you, dear," she said, her voice soft but warm. "I'm afraid these old arms aren't what they used to be." I offered to carry her bags to her car, but she hesitated, glancing down the street. "I don't have a car," she admitted after a moment. "I walked to the bus stop, it's not far." It wasn't far, but the weight of the bags made the distance seem longer than it was. Without thinking, I offered to drive her home. She hesitated again, studying me with a cautious smile, but eventually nodded. "That's very kind of you," she said, and I could see the relief in her eyes. We loaded the bags into my trunk, and as we drove, she told me her name was Margaret. She lived alone in a small apartment on the other side of town, and the bus was her only way to get around. Her husband had passed away years ago, and with no children to help her, she managed as best she could on her own. She spoke with a quiet dignity that made me feel both humbled and ashamed forever, considering walking past her. When we reached her apartment building, I insisted on carrying the bags to her door. It was a modest place, clean but worn, with walls that told stories of years gone by. Margaret invited me in for a cup of tea as thanks, and though I initially planned to decline, something made me say yes. Her apartment was cozy, filled with old photographs and knickknacks that hinted at a life full of memories. She poured 2 cups of tea and set out a plate of shortbread cookies, and we sat at her small kitchen table, talking as if we'd known each other for years. She told me about her late husband, how they'd met at a dance hall in the 1950s and fallen in love over shared laughter and stolen glances. She spoke of their travels, the places they'd seen, and the life they'd built together before he passed. I found myself sharing pieces of my own life too, my struggles at work, the stress of trying to stay afloat in a world that often felt overwhelming. Margaret listened with an attentiveness that felt rare and genuine, offering words of wisdom that somehow cut through the fog of my frustrations. "Life has a way of throwing challenges at us," she said, her hands cradling her teacup. "But it's not the challenges that define us, it's how we choose to face them." Her words stayed with me long after I left that evening. As I drove home, I realized that helping her, that small act of kindness, had done something I hadn't expected. It had shifted my perspective. For so long, I'd been so consumed by my own problems that I hadn't stopped to consider the world around me, the people who might be carrying burdens far heavier than my own. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I decided to pay that kindness forward, volunteering at a local shelter that weekend and finding a renewed sense of purpose in helping others. It wasn't about grand gestures or monumental changes, it was about the little things, the small acts of humanity that remind us we're all connected. Margaret and I stayed in touch after that day, exchanging phone calls and occasional visits. She became a friend, a confidant, and a source of quiet strength in my life. And though our meeting had been born of chance, it was a reminder that even the smallest moments can have the biggest impact. That one random act of kindness didn't just change Margaret's day, it changed my outlook on life. It reminded me of the power we all have to make a difference, no matter how small, and how those ripples can spread further than we ever imagine. I had always been a skeptic. The kind of person who dismissed anything that seemed too surreal or impossible. When my friends told me about a class they were taking, a philosophy of existence course at a local community college, I laughed it off. I had no interest in pondering the meaning of life or whatever fluffy content they were feeding into those lecture halls. But one fateful Tuesday, as the autumn leaves danced spirals around my feet, something strange nudged me towards the campus. Call it curiosity or boredom, maybe both, but after a brief tug-of-war with my conscience, I found myself signing up for the course. I shouldn't have, but something in the air felt charged, almost electric. The room was dimly lit and packed, crammed with faces of varying ages, students, old folks, even a woman with silver hair knitting quietly in the back. The professor was an eccentric old man with wild spectacles that seemed to magnify his blue eyes. He introduced himself as Dr. Langston, and I could tell he was passionate. He spoke about existence as if it were a tangible object, oscillating in space like the planets in our solar system. On that first day, he showed us a video, a documentary with unsettling footage of people living in dire conditions, juxtaposed against the backdrop of everyday life in affluent neighborhoods. It was jarring. Over the weeks that followed, Dr. Langston pushed us beyond our comfort zones. He encouraged us to think deeply, debate fiercely, and unearth our assumptions about life. One day, he handed us an assignment that sent chills up my spine, write about a moment when your life was altered irrevocably. I struggled initially, racking my brain for something significant, something profound. I ended up recounting a mundane experience, a harmless car accident I had as a teenager. I felt silly. But when I read my paper aloud, something strange happened. I became lost in the emotions of that event, the crippling fear, the chaos of twisting metal, and the bone-deep realization that life is fragile. Dr. Langston listened intently, nodding with understanding. But that week, a gravitational shift began in my perspective. I started to observe the world differently. The old man's words lingered like a fog, drawing my attention to the mundane miracles around me, the way light glimmered through leaves or how strangers smiled unexpectedly. I felt detached, like a ghost wandering my own life. But it wasn't all zen. Soon, I began to see something unshakable lurking beneath the surface. One day, Dr. Langston announced a special guest for our class, a former student named Alice, who had taken the course nearly a decade prior. Her stories were mesmerizing, filled with emotions and hard-won wisdom about grief and loss. But there was a haunting quality in her eyes, an urgency that pushed her words. As she spoke about her journey losing a loved one, something peculiar occurred, people began to cry. It was cathartic. For many, I sensed it was a release of burdens too heavy to carry alone. But in that vulnerable moment, I felt an unseen veil tear. I was drawn to the idea that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't just about existence, it was about connection, about choice, about love and loss intertwined. I began spending hours contemplating my own connections, allowing old memories to swell, but not just those of joy. The more I dove into my past, the darker it became, the shadow of guilt for how I had treated people flickered back into view. After weeks of introspection, I learned about each classmate's journey. Each person sat with their own ghosts, and there were whispered tales of heartache, betrayal, and redemption. My cynicism began to erode, replaced by a jagged clarity about what truly mattered. One evening, Dr. Langston announced an upcoming field trip, a visit to an abandoned asylum, a relic of forgotten lives once lived. The class was invited to explore the ruins and think about the people who had been lost to time. I'll never forget that night. Walking through the darkened halls of that asylum, I felt the weight of each soul that once inhabited that space, their stories hushed by shadow. As we wandered, I couldn't help but imagine their lives, their laughter, their sorrows echoing off the crumbling walls. I found myself alone in a musty room filled with peeling wallpaper. That's when I saw it, a figure, translucent and draped in a gown, standing in the corner. She stared right at me, her features obscured by time. My breath caught in my throat. Instinctively, I reached out to touch her, but she flickered and disappeared like smoke. What the hell was happening? Was I losing my mind? I stumbled into the hallway, shaken, and joined my classmates who were gathered around Dr. Langston, discussing what they had felt. I could only stand silent in shock, burdened with visions of the past. Over the following weeks, I frequently found myself returning to the asylum, sneaking away to relive the exploration, delving into those corridors filled with echoes of life long gone. Each trip intensified the sensation that I was meant to uncover something vital there, something connecting my own life to theirs. As the semester drew to a close, I was approached by Dr. Langston after class. He sat me down, his manner serious but compassionate. He told me he could see how deeply I was affected, how the threads of my existence were intertwining with the spectral energy of the asylum. He urged me to confront these feelings, to no longer suppress the past that had haunted me. You need to embrace it, he said, the chaos, it's an essential part of your journey. The end of that semester felt like the climax of a grand narrative. The experiences had reshaped my understanding of everything. I left the classroom that day with a weight in my chest yet a clarity in my mind. I finally understood, life was made up of moments, connections, and the irreplaceable fragments of our existence. I realized that my skeptically barricaded heart had cracked open, allowing the light of connection and vulnerability within. Even as the leaves fell behind me, I felt renewed. Then, without warning, tragedy struck just days later. I received a text. Dr. Langston had passed away unexpectedly, an aneurysm. The news pulled the rug out from under me. It felt surreal, as if the fabric of my new reality were unraveling. I rushed to campus, desperate to find some semblance of understanding among my classmates who shared this profound loss. We gathered, exchanged memories, grief spilling forth and gathering like storm clouds. That night, we returned to the asylum, candles in hand, and shared our stories, the air thick with emotion. In that hollow space of forgotten lives, we created our own. Tears mingled with laughter as we spoke of the old man who had changed us all. His words had lingered, woven through each corner of our experiences, binding us together even in our sorrow. I realized, in that moment, how deeply connected we all are, how each whisper of past lives weaves the tapestry of our own. It was a class that did change my perspective on life, but more than that, it was the depth of connection I experienced that night, a profound reminder that the weight of existence is best carried together. Sometimes, change comes when you least expect it, enmeshed in the most mundane moments that flicker like shadows, urging you to embrace every fleeting chance at connection. To this day, I carry Dr. Langston's lessons with me, a guiding star shining through the noise of existence, and I write this with the hope that others may realize we are never alone in the chaos. Yes, life is fragile and fleeting, but it's also filled with moments, connections, and echoes of those who have walked before us, each one a lesson waiting to be unwrapped. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I can't help but feel like that brief moment changed everything. It started when I was driving back from a long day at work, tired and ready to sink into my couch and binge-watch something mindless to forget about the grind of my 9 to 5. The sun had started to set, casting a golden glow over the pavement, and I noticed a figure standing by the side of the road, thumbing for a ride. At first, I hesitated. The last thing I wanted to do was pick up a stranger, but something in the air felt different, almost electric. Out of nowhere, I pulled over. The figure turned out to be a young woman, probably in her late 20s. She had messy hair, a worn backpack slung over one shoulder, and looked like she had been traveling for quite some time. I could see the relief wash over her face as she approached my car. "Thank you. You have no idea how long I've been waiting," she said, slipping into the passenger seat. I introduced myself, and she told me her name was Jess. As I drove, the conversation flowed more naturally than I expected. Jess spoke passionately about her dreams of becoming a photographer, about traveling the world and capturing every moment. She was going to a job interview at a local gallery and seemed so hopeful. I shared a bit about my monotonous corporate job, and she shook her head with a sympathetic smile, urging me to chase my own dreams. We pulled into a coffee shop so she could grab a quick bite before her interview. Jess thanked me again, and as she hopped out, a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, crossed her face when she glanced back at me. I waved it off, hoping she was just nervous about her upcoming interview. After she grabbed her coffee, she was all smiles, and as she stepped back into the car, I could see her excitement bubbling over. I parked in front of the gallery where her interview was being held, and she took a deep breath to calm her nerves. "You know, I have to pay this forward somehow," Jess said with a grin. "You saved my day, I can't thank you enough." She fished out a small camera from her bag and snapped a quick photo of me. "For luck," she said, flashing a smile that illuminated her face. I laughed and said I hoped it would work. After a quick goodbye, she dashed into the gallery. I pulled away and headed home, thinking about how that simple interaction felt surprisingly uplifting. But through the night and into the next day, I noticed something was off. My phone buzzed relentlessly. It was my friend Mia, sending frantic texts asking if I had heard the news. "No," I responded. "What news?" It turned out the gallery where Jess had gone for her interview was the same location where a massive explosion had occurred just an hour after I dropped her off. Reports flooded in about chaos and the lives it had impacted. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was Jess okay? Did she make it out? I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that engulfed me. I spent the entire night checking the news and social media, hoping to see a sign that she was all right. But as the hours ticked by, my heart sank deeper. It wasn't until the next morning that I finally spotted a post on a local news page showing a group of people being rescued from the wreckage. I squinted at the small thumbnails of survivors, praying she was among them. And then, there she was, dirt-streaked and wide-eyed, but alive. Relief surged through me, crawling over the fear of how close I had come to losing a total stranger. I immediately commented on the post, urging people to find her, hoping she knew how fortunate she was. Then, unexpectedly, my phone buzzed with a message. It was Jess. "I'm okay," she wrote. "You saved my life." For a moment, I didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "I just gave you a ride," I typed back, wrestling with confusion. "No," she replied. "I wasn't in there yet. That ride, your kindness, it made me late." I was so caught up in our conversation and chasing my dreams that I completely forgot the time. "If you hadn't stopped for me, I'd have been inside when it happened." I felt lightheaded, a whirlpool of emotions crashing over me. The universe had conspired to bring us together, and I, just a regular person, had unknowingly altered the course of someone's life. Jess and I stayed in touch over the next few weeks. She told me she dedicated a photo series to the day I almost lost my life. Each picture represented a moment from that day, the ride, the coffee, the smiles, and she insisted on including me in the series, calling me her guardian angel. We eventually met up for coffee one afternoon. She was bubbling with excitement, having secured an internship from the gallery that day, despite the chaos. It felt surreal, like I was watching a movie unfold in slow motion as she talked about how she would showcase her work in exhibitions around the country. Her perspective on life was contagious. For Jess, every second mattered now more than ever. We built a beautiful friendship forged in our brief encounter, and for reasons I can't fully articulate, I started reevaluating my own life. I too began dreaming again. I ventured into photography, partly inspired by her journey. Before I knew it, we were collaborating, capturing moments that would make an impact and ignite a spark in others. My mundane existence bloomed into excitement, filled with purpose that I thought was long lost under the weight of responsibilities. An unexpected twist of fate, a shared moment, had transformed not only Jess's life but mine as well. Yet, as empowering as it felt, I couldn't shake the thought of how different our paths would have been if I hadn't pulled over that day. I often wonder about the other lives we intersect with, how small decisions ripple out into something greater. The strangest part? Time won't stop its relentless march. Days turned into months, and slowly, Jess began to grow her brand, even getting noticed by some prestigious galleries. Meanwhile, my own photography was gaining traction, and soon enough, we were viewed as up-and-coming artists in our community. But on the day when we received our invitations to showcase our work on a bigger stage, I got a text from Jess that struck the deepest chord of gratitude and joy in me. "Remember that ride?" she texted. "It changed everything." And in those words, I saw both our lives intertwined forever, realizing that who we meet in life and how we treat them could make all the difference, even if it's just a car ride on a fading evening. So the next time you're driving and see someone on the side of the road, remember, you might just be the one to shift the course of their life, or even your own. The moment I knew I had to change my life, my awakening. The moment I knew I had to change my life wasn't one of those gradual realizations that build over time. It was like getting hit by a freight train of clarity, a single instant that shattered the glass of denial I'd been hiding behind. It was late one evening, and I was sitting in my cluttered apartment, the kind of mess that had become so familiar I stopped noticing it. Pizza boxes stacked in the corner, unwashed dishes filling the sink, a faint smell of something I couldn't quite place but knew wasn't pleasant. My laptop was balanced precariously on my knees, glowing with the pale blue light of yet another mindless binge-watching session. I wasn't even paying attention to the show. My phone buzzed beside me, and for a moment, I ignored it. I wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone. But then it buzzed again, and something in me compelled me to glance at the screen. It was a notification for an event I'd completely forgotten about, a reunion for my college friends, a group I hadn't seen in years. The picture attached to the invite was a candid shot of us from our senior year. We looked so young, so full of life, laughing together on the quad with the sun setting behind us. I stared at the photo, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't recognize myself anymore. The person in the picture had bright eyes, a genuine smile, a spark of something I couldn't even name. The person sitting on that couch, staring at the screen, was a shadow of that. I hadn't just let myself go physically, I'd let everything go. My dreams, my ambitions, even my connections to the people who once mattered most. It was like waking up from a deep sleep and realizing you'd been sleepwalking through your life for years. I started scrolling through old photos, unable to stop myself, and with every picture, the weight in my chest grew heavier. There I was, climbing a mountain during a spring break trip, arms outstretched as if I could touch the sky. There I was, at a karaoke bar, belting out a song terribly but confidently, with my friends cheering me on. There I was, at graduation, clutching my diploma with tears in my eyes, ready to take on the world. What had happened to that person? The answer wasn't hard to find. Somewhere along the way, I'd started choosing the easy path, the path of least resistance. I'd taken a job I didn't love because it paid the bills. I'd stopped reaching out to friends because it was easier to stay in and avoid the effort. I'd let my hobbies and passions collect dust because there was always tomorrow to pick them back up, except tomorrow never came. The realization was suffocating. I felt like I was drowning in the life I'd created, a life that wasn't really living. The worst part was knowing that no one had done this to me. I couldn't blame anyone else. I had chosen this, step by step, day by day, until I'd ended up in a place I hated. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed a notebook from the pile of clutter on my coffee table and started writing. At first, it was just a stream of consciousness, messy and chaotic, but then it started to take shape. I wrote down everything I hated about my current life, the job that drained me, the loneliness that clung to me like a second skin, the sense of purposelessness that had taken root in my soul. But then I flipped to a new page and started writing down what I wanted. Not the vague, abstract dreams of happiness or success, but concrete, tangible things. I wanted to reconnect with my friends. I wanted to feel healthy and strong again. I wanted to wake up in the morning excited about something, anything. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. The next day, I called out of work. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew I couldn't keep going through the motions. I spent the day cleaning my apartment, scrubbing away not just the physical mess but the emotional weight it represented. I deleted the fast food apps on my phone and made a grocery list of real, nourishing food. I texted the friend who had sent the reunion invite, apologizing for being out of touch and asking if they wanted to grab coffee before the event. It was terrifying, reaching out after so much time, but their enthusiastic response melted some of the fear away. Over the next few weeks, I kept making small changes. I started going for walks after work, just to get out of the apartment and clear my head. I dusted off my guitar, which had been sitting in the corner untouched for years, and began playing again, fumbling through chords until my fingers remembered what my mind had forgotten. I signed up for a class in something I'd always wanted to learn, photography. The first day, I was so nervous I almost didn't go, but I forced myself out the door, and by the end of the session, I felt a spark of that old excitement creeping back and the reunion was the real test. I was terrified to see everyone, afraid they'd judge me for how far I'd fallen. But when I walked into the room and saw their faces light up, all that fear melted away. They didn't care that I wasn't where I thought I'd be by now. They were just happy to see me, to laugh and reminisce and catch up on the years we'd missed. By the end of the night, I felt like a part of myself had been restored, a piece of the puzzle I didn't even realize was missing. It wasn't easy, rebuilding my life. There were days when I wanted to give up, when the pull of my old habits felt almost too strong to resist. But every time I felt like slipping back, I thought about that photo, the one of me and my friends on the quad, and I remembered the person I used to be. She was still there, buried under years of neglect, but she wasn't gone. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like her again. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see someone I recognize, someone I'm proud of. It wasn't some grand, cinematic moment that changed everything. It was a series of small, deliberate choices, each one pulling me a little closer to the life I wanted. And it all started with that one night, that one moment of clarity, when I knew I had to change my life. I never thought vacation could turn into a nightmare, but that's exactly what happened when I got lost in a foreign country. It all began in a small seaside town in Greece, a place where the sun kissed your skin, and the scent of fresh seafood filled the air. My friends and I were thrilled, fueled by excitement and a few too many shots of ouzo the night before. We decided to explore the vibrant streets, which were a labyrinth of narrow alleys, winding our way through pastel-colored houses with bougainvillea draping from the walls. Everything was picturesque and welcoming until I noticed something odd. A path diverged from the main road, barely visible, almost hidden behind a cluster of trees. Curiosity got the best of me, and I wanted to see where it led. My friends warned me not to stray too far, but the thrill of adventure pulled me in like a moth to a flame. I ventured down the narrow trail, the uneven cobblestones crunching beneath my sandals. As I walked deeper, sounds of laughter and music faded away, replaced by the distant crashing of waves. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a small, abandoned cottage. Its windows were shattered, and a tangle of vines had formed over the door like a natural barrier, but there was something eerily beautiful about it. I peeked inside, heart pounding, and found remnants of a life once lived. A dusty, old guitar leaned in one corner, and the scent of mildew filled the air. I stepped inside, drawn to the melancholy of the place, and suddenly, I felt a shiver race down my spine. It was as if something was watching me. But I brushed it off. I took a few pictures, hoping to share the discovery with my friends later. After wandering around the cottage for a while, I finally decided to head back, retracing my steps. But the path I had followed was gone. I looked around in a panic, realizing the trees that had seemed welcoming now loomed over me, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember. I thought back to the main road and took a deep breath, thankful for the vibrant blue sky above. I began walking, but the more I walked, the more my surroundings changed. The air grew still, and an uncomfortable chill settled in. I picked up my pace, muttering under my breath, trying to ward off the panic rising within me. I called out for my friends, but only silence greeted me. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper that carried on the breeze, barely audible yet full of urgency. I froze, heart racing. It called my name in a soft, inviting tone, beckoning me deeper. I didn't respond, instinct kicking in to run away from it rather than toward it, but the whisper slithered through the branches, weaving a web of curiosity that kept pulling me back, even as I fought the urge. I followed the sound for what felt like hours, twisting and turning through the forest-like maze, until I stumbled upon a clearing bathed in a haunting twilight glow. It was so beautiful yet unsettling, with an impossibly perfect circle of flowers surrounding a single, gnarled tree in the center. This tree looked ancient, its bark twisted in ways that defied logic. And then I saw them, the shadows. There were figures standing just outside the edge of the clearing, partially hidden, watching with an intent that sent ice through my veins. My first instinct was to turn and flee, but curiosity anchored me to the spot. One figure stepped forward, pale and ethereal, its features indistinct and blurry like an old photograph left in the sun too long. It raised a hand, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me, as if this entity could erase all my fears. But instinct kicked in again, tearing me from my lethargy. I turned and bolted back into the trees, branches clawing at my skin, my mind screaming for my friends. I lost track of time, my footsteps pounding like a frantic heart. As I broke through the trees, I found myself stumbling back onto the main road, drenched in sweat, gasping for air, and my body thrumming with adrenaline. But something felt off. The sun that had been bright above me now hung low, casting long, eerie shadows as the sky turned a haunting shade of orange. I searched desperately for my friends, hoping they were just around the corner. I walked along the path until I reached the small square where we had parted ways earlier, my heart hammering in my chest. But the square was empty. Panic surged through me. I reached for my phone, praying for a signal, but my screen flashed no service. I was utterly alone. I wandered through the deserted streets, the typical joyful buzz of tourists replaced by an unsettling silence. Days seemed to blur together as I searched every corner of that town, each street leading me back to the same places but never to my friends. Each night fell with the weight of despair, the once enchanting village transforming into a landscape of shadows. I revisited the clearing in my dreams, haunted by the whispers and the invite to join them. One night, as I dredged through the same alleys, I heard that familiar whisper again, this time clearer, louder, more insistent. It wrapped around my mind like smoke, promising comfort. But I fought back the urge to follow, knowing it was a call to something darker. Desperation clawed at my chest. I eventually returned to the main road, hoping that retracing my steps would somehow lead me back to the cottage and then back to my friends. But as I approached the spot where the path had diverged that fateful day, I was met with an old man, dressed in tattered clothes, sitting against a tree, his gaze unwavering. There was an intensity in his eyes that made my stomach twist. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he rasped, his voice low and hollow. My breath hitched, I had no idea what he was talking about. "You saw the tree and the figures," he continued, his gaze piercing into mine. "You heard their whispers." Fear pooled in my gut. All I could do was nod. "You should have left it alone," he said, his tone laced with regret. "They're waiting for someone to join them. Once you hear the call, it's hard to resist." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. He went on to tell me about the lost souls trapped in that clearing, how they lured the curious and the lonely to become part of their eternal existence. I couldn't breathe, the weight of my situation pressing down on me. I stumbled back, trying to process what he was saying, but my heart knew he was right. A hidden chill crept back into my bones. "It's too late for you," he whispered, eyes clouding with pity. "But maybe you can still save your friends." At that moment, a chilling realization swept through me. My friends hadn't just wandered off, they had been taken by the same force that had called to me. I had to make a choice, return to the clearing and confront the source of the whispers, or keep running. With a shaky resolve, I sprinted back to the secluded path, navigating through the dimly lit forest. I reached the clearing just as twilight fell, and the figures emerged once again, waiting with an otherworldly patience. As I entered, I felt a wave of warmth wrapped around me, and the whispers swirled through my head. "Join us," they sang, "you are one of us now." I fought against the pull, searching desperately for my friends. "They're with us too," the silhouette replied, and suddenly, I saw them, pale and vacant, standing at the edge, their eyes glazed. "Please. No." I screamed, my voice reverberating against the trees. But my cries were swallowed by the laughter that echoed through the air, pulling at my sanity. Just when it felt like all was lost, I remembered the old man's warning. I focused all my willpower on my friends. "You're stronger than this. Fight it," I shouted until my throat burned. Their heads turned toward me, the glaze of their eyes beginning to fade, a flicker of recognition shining through. I screamed their names, urging them to return to me. As I reached for them, I felt a crushing force pulling me back, ready to claim me as one of its minions. But I didn't give up. I had to fight for them, for my own survival. Every ounce of my strength was focused on breaking the spell that had them in its grasp. With one final, desperate push, I lunged forward, grasping their hands and pulling them back into reality. The shadows clawed at us, the air thick with tension, but together we broke through the barrier, collapsing in a heap at the edge of the clearing, gasping for breath. It felt like we had never left the square but somehow held on to the thread of life. We stumbled back onto the path as dawn's light broke through the trees, the darkness receding behind us like a bad dream. We didn't speak about it, but we knew we had encountered something that could never be put into words, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. We fled the town that day, the laughing shadows echoing long after we exited, a memory that would haunt us forever. I often think about that cottage and the hidden path. I wonder how many others had been lost like me and how many souls remain trapped in a never-ending dance of despair. Whenever vacation comes around again, a chill runs down my spine as I recall the whispers that beckon from the darkness, always waiting for someone curious enough to answer. But this time, I promise I'll ignore the call, even if the whispering winds try to convince me otherwise. The day my pet taught me an important lesson. The day my pet taught me an important lesson. When I first got Chester, a scrappy little terrier mix with a knack for finding trouble, I had no idea how much my life was going to change. Chester was supposed to be a companion, something to keep me company in my small, creaky apartment. But it turned out that Chester was much more than a loyal pet, he was the best friend I'd ever had. He was quirky, with an intense look in his eyes that always seemed to know more than he let on. He had this way of staring at me like he was trying to communicate something I could never quite understand, like there was a secret he was desperate to share. I never thought much of it until that day, the day I realized Chester had been trying to teach me something all along. It started out like any other morning, the soft light creeping in through the window, illuminating the dust in the air, the quiet hum of the city outside. Chester was unusually restless, pacing around the room, sniffing the air with a strange intensity. I figured he'd heard something, a car backfiring, someone moving furniture in the apartment next door, but the way he looked at me was different. There was urgency in his eyes, almost a sense of fear, like he was trying to tell me something was wrong. I brushed it off, distracted by my own morning routine. But Chester wouldn't let up. He kept pacing, barking in short, sharp bursts that echoed through the quiet apartment. I knelt down, tried to calm him, but he was inconsolable, pulling at the hem of my pants with his teeth, tugging me toward the door with more force than I'd ever seen in him before. I tried to laugh it off, but there was something unsettling about it, something in the way he wouldn't look away, his eyes wide and pleading. All right, I sighed, grabbing his leash. Maybe he just needed some fresh air, I thought. I opened the door, and he shot out into the hallway, his little paws echoing on the floor, his body tense and ready. But as I followed him outside, I noticed something strange. The street was empty, unnaturally quiet for this time of day. There was an eerie stillness, the usual bustle and noise gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Chester tugged me down the street, pulling with a determination that I'd never seen before, guiding me down alleyways and side streets that I'd never taken. My heart started to race as I realized we were heading toward the old abandoned house at the edge of town, the one everyone said was haunted, the one parents warned their kids about. I'd never been near it before, never had a reason to, but now Chester seemed intent on leading me there, his nose low to the ground, his tail held high like he was on a mission. We reached the house, its windows dark and empty, the paint peeling off the walls like dead skin. Chester scratched at the door, whimpering softly, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to turn back, to take him home, but something held me there, some unspoken bond between us that compelled me to trust him. I opened the door, the old wood creaking beneath my fingers, and we stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay hanging heavy in the air. Chester led me through the dark, empty rooms, his paws silent on the floorboards as he guided me deeper into the house. I felt a growing unease, a sense of dread that built with each step, but I couldn't stop. Chester was on a mission, and I was trapped in his wake, following him down a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, we reached a door at the end of the hall, its surface scarred and battered, like someone had tried to claw their way through. Chester stopped, his eyes fixed on the door, his body tense and alert. He turned to me, and in that moment, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, a warning, a plea. I swallowed, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room, empty except for a single, old chair in the center. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Chester stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the chair, and I realized he was trembling, his body tense with fear. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it, a faint, shadowy figure, barely visible, sitting in the chair, its head tilted toward us in a silent, unseeing gaze. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, feel its cold, empty gaze boring into me. Chester let out a low growl, his hackles raised, his body pressed against my leg as if to protect me. I didn't understand, didn't know what he was trying to tell me, but I could feel his fear, feel his desperation to get me out of that room. I turned to leave, pulling Chester with me, but as I stepped into the hallway, I heard a voice, soft and whispery, like the wind passing through dead leaves. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, and I felt a chill settle over me, a coldness that seeped into my bones. I ran, pulling Chester along with me, my heart racing as we stumbled down the stairs and out into the blinding light of day. I didn't stop until we were back at home, safe within the familiar walls of our apartment, the quiet hum of the city outside a comforting reminder of normalcy. But Chester was different, quieter, more subdued. He didn't look at me the same way, didn't have that playful spark in his eyes. It was like something had changed between us, like he'd seen something I couldn't understand, something he could never unsee. For days, I tried to put it out of my mind, tried to convince myself that it was all a bad dream, a figment of my imagination. But every night, as I lay in bed, I could feel that cold gaze, that whisper of warning echoing in my mind. Chester stayed close to me, always watching, always alert, as if he knew that something had followed us back, something that was waiting, lurking in the shadows. And then, one night, I woke up to find him standing at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on something in the corner of the room, something I couldn't see. He let out a low growl, his body tense, his gaze unwavering. I sat up, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, nothing but shadows and silence. Chester looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't explain, a sadness that seemed to say goodbye. The next morning, he was gone. I searched everywhere, calling his name, tearing the apartment apart in a desperate frenzy, but he was nowhere to be found. It was like he'd vanished, like he'd been taken by something I couldn't understand. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to move on, tried to accept that Chester was gone. But every night, I could feel that cold presence, feel that whisper of warning echoing in my mind. And every night, I wondered if he'd left to protect me, if he'd sacrificed himself to keep me safe from something I couldn't see, something I couldn't fight. I don't know where he is, don't know if he's still out there, watching over me from some place beyond my understanding. But I know that he taught me an important lesson that day, that there are things in this world that we can't see, things that linger in the shadows, waiting, watching, and that sometimes, the ones we love will do anything to protect us from the darkness, even if it means leaving us behind. I never thought that helping a child learn something new could lead down such a dark path. It started on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I was babysitting my neighbor's 10-year-old daughter, Lily, a bright and imaginative girl with an infectious curiosity. While her parents were out at a charity event, we decided to spend the evening doing something fun. I set up a little makeshift science lab in the kitchen, stocked with baking soda, vinegar, and a handful of colorful food dyes. We giggled through a few experiments, clouds of fizz and color erupting like tiny volcanoes. Lily was enthralled, her big brown eyes sparkling with excitement, and we ended up making a mess that would take her parents hours to clean up. As the hour got late, she pulled an old dusty book off the shelf titled Beginner's Guide to the Supernatural. I raised an eyebrow, half expecting it to be one of those cheesy kids' books about ghosts or magic. When she asked me to read it, I figured, why not? Crazy tales of spirits, haunted places, and bizarre rituals filled the pages. Somehow, the atmospheric descriptions made the stories linger in the air as if they were alive. One story, in particular, caught our attention, the tale of a game called The Hidden. It involved conjuring an entity through a series of simple questions and a daring invitation to join us here in the real world. Lily was mesmerized. I brushed it off at first, teasing her about believing in imaginary creatures, but then she powered through, her enthusiasm infectious. My initial hesitations melted away, and before I knew it, I found myself agreeing. We needed a quiet space, a bathroom, away from the prying eyes of the night. Armed with a flashlight and shaky hands, the two of us squeezed into the cramped space, the door locked behind us. I felt like a grown-up fool, indulging a child in fantasies, but her energy ignited a flickering spark of daring in me. I recalled a few spooky campfire stories from my own childhood and began to chant the rhyme that was strangely laid out in that tattered book. If you hear me, come to play, hide with us for a day. The air thickened, and a chill wind blew through the room, sending goosebumps racing down my arms. I laughed nervously, glancing at Lily, who was just as tense but brimming with excitement. We repeated the phrases, laughing at our nerves until the laughter faded. Then, a banging noise echoed from outside, rattling the window and startling us, shattering our fragile bubble of bravery. "Did you hear that?" Lily whispered, her voice quivering in the otherwise quiet darkness. I nodded, but held my breath instead of responding. As if the universe was mocking us, the bathroom lights flickered, illuminating faces of fear reflected in the tiny mirror. I could feel it too, something ancient, something restless was coming alive around us, clawing at the edges of the shadowed room. I held my breath as I lifted the flashlight, focusing its beam on the wall, half expecting a ghost to pop out and laugh at our expense. Just when I was about to make some silly joke to ease the tension, I heard the softest of whispers. It was barely audible, like a gentle brush of wind. "Help me." My heart slammed in my chest, a primal fear taking hold of my rational mind. The voice was distorted, sounding like an anguished child, a sound that cut through the veil of excitement that had cloaked me just moments ago. I glanced at Lily, her face pale and eyes wide as she clutched my sleeve, her grip tightening as if sensing my own dread. "Did you hear that?" she gasped, trembling. Committing to the bit felt like risking more than just our dignity now. I forced a shaky smile, trying to downplay the rising horror. "It's just the wind," I lied, but my voice trembled, bordering on panic. Without another word, we shared a look that determined our fate. We needed to escape this absurdity. In my effort to lead us out, I turned sharply, and the flashlight flickered. The beam illuminated the bathroom door, but the light flickered again, and my blood ran cold when I realized that Lily was no longer beside me. I spun around, frantic, sweeping the flashlight frantically. "Lily!" I called, freaking out inside, desperate. Then, the unmistakable creaking of the bathroom door echoed behind me. In the dim light, it swung open slowly, drawing a shadowy outline of what could have been Serenity, a small child-colored figure nestled in the folds of the inky dark. My heart raced as I barely recognized Lily standing in the doorway, but something was off. She wore a clown mask that had mysteriously appeared from nowhere. "Lily, take off the mask," I shouted, but there was a sparkle in her eye I had never seen before. "You said I should help it," she whispered, her voice low, as if she were colluding with something unseen. The flashlight flickered just as I reached the door, and I felt a force pulling me back. I stumbled, falling onto the bathroom tiles as an unsettling laughter filled the room, so haunting, it stretched beyond any rational explanation. The air swirled around me, heavy with an unseen presence that surrounded me like an invisible storm. "Help me," the voice echoed, now layered inside Lily's words, the resonance shifting as if it had intertwined with her very being. She stepped forward, and my heart raced as I realized her grip on reality was slipping. "Lily, come back," I shouted, scrambling against the floor. Just as suddenly as the darkness had enveloped us, the bathroom lights burst back on, illuminating the room in an icy fluorescent glare. As the shadows shrank and scattered, I lunged forward, forcing her mask to the ground, but the child I once knew was gone, replaced by a hollow gaze devoid of innocence. "She wants to play," she repeated, her voice strangely melodic. Panic twisted my stomach into knots as I grabbed her arm, desperately shaking her back to reality. "This isn't a game. Come back." But she just laughed, that childlike giggle, echoing off the walls, a sound that now felt more sinister than innocent. Sorrow pierced through me as utter hopelessness surged. Before I could process it all, the house shifted, the walls creaked and groaned, closing in around us. I fumbled at the door, but it slammed shut in my face. Was this some punishment for indulging a child's whimsy? "Help me," she whispered again, her eyes flickering with a blend of fear and admiration. I felt like I was losing her, slippage of time churning darker. Just as I feared that this could all spiral into something irreversible, a sense of clarity surged through me. I had to act fast, whatever this was, I couldn't let it take her. "If you want to play," I shouted, pulling everything inside me, "then let her go. This is a game, remember? Let her win." The laughter faded for a moment, replaced with an eerie silence that hung in the air like a heavy fog. Lily blinked, momentarily shaken. "What?" I grabbed her shoulders, focusing every ounce of my will onto her. "You're stronger than this, Lily. Remember the experiments? Together we can control it." Her eyes flickered again, holding on to a glimmer of recognition. Just as the room shifted around us, shadows lurked menacingly, waiting for a response. The laughter resumed, but this time it felt fainter. "We can banish whatever this is," I yelled, picking up the mask and tossing it aside, the weight of darkness pressing down on us. "You have to fight. Fight back." For a heartbeat, the world around us stilled. Time twisted as if reality itself didn't know what to do next. Then, out of nowhere, a rush of cold air exploded through the space like a tsunami, and every door flung open. The laughter rose to a deafening crescendo, drowning me in vertigo. A shadow danced at the edge of my eyes, but in that heartbeat, I realized, laughter turned to screams. And in that blink, I found myself alone in the bathroom, a hollow void suddenly occupying the space where Lily once stood. My heart pounded violently in my chest, but I knew, somewhere deep down, that helping her was the only way to win this game. As the echoes of "help me" faded, forever lost in the chaotic whirlwind of uncertainty, I resolved to fight, to reclaim what had been taken. Because I refused to let this supernatural force steal her away without a struggle. Whatever had happened, whatever had taken over Lily, I was not finished. This was only the beginning, and by the end of this, I would make sure that child would learn something new, what it truly meant to fight back against the darkness. I never believed in taking time for myself. I was the kind of person who thought self-care was a joke. I'd see articles about meditation, bubble baths, and journaling, and I'd roll my eyes. Who had time for that? My job at the accounting firm consumed my life, and I prided myself on being the hardest worker in the office. My colleagues would stay late, but I'd be the last to leave, preparing financial reports and staring into my screen like a digital zombie. Over the years, my health started to decline. Headaches became a constant, my back hurt from hours hunched over the keyboard, and the endless cycle of caffeine and stress was the only rhythm my body knew. Then came the night that altered everything. It started as a regular Tuesday. I was slated to finish up a month's worth of financial statements when a storm rolled in, heavy rain lashing against the office windows. Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. My coworker, Marissa, a bubbly woman who always pushed me to join her for yoga sessions, glanced at the storm with concern. "You should take a break, Ryan. It's getting pretty bad out there." I shrugged her off, announcing I'd be fine. A soft whistle passed through the drafts of the office. "You're working too hard, you know. Burnout's a real thing." I waved her off, and she begrudgingly returned to her desk with a resigned sigh. Hours crawled by, shadows growing deeper as the sky darkened. I was lost in an Excel spreadsheet when the lights flickered and went out. A citywide blackout had left our office in uncomfortable darkness. The sound of the storm grew louder, the wind howling through the cracks. Great, I thought. Just my luck. I'm stuck here in this miserable place with no power, forced to contend with my thoughts. As I checked my phone for any signal, I saw a few missed messages. Marissa had texted, asking if I was okay, but there was no point in replying. I was fine. Then the temperature dropped like a stone. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and decided to check the windows. As I walked across the darkened office floor, the shadows danced in strange shapes, and the wind howled outside like a pack of wolves. It's just the storm, I told myself firmly, trying to rid my thoughts of absurd images of paranormal entities. I reached the window, pushing against the cold glass. I could hardly see through the rain, only flashes of lightning illuminating my dim office. I suddenly felt a shiver, not from the cold, but a prickle of fear that rippled down my spine. Something didn't feel right. I turned back towards my desk, but my movement froze in place. Out of the corner of my eye, something dark seemed to flicker on the opposite wall. I squinted, blinking at the shapes that slipped in and out of the shadows. The fear tightened in my stomach, but I brushed it off as my imagination running wild. No one else was in the office, maybe I was just tired. Just as I turned back towards my desk, my phone vibrated in my pocket, making me jump. I pulled it out, seeing a message from Marissa, "Ryan, please leave. You shouldn't be alone." I rolled my eyes, the usual bravado rising again. I didn't need to listen to her. I was going to finish my work. I flipped my phone back into my pocket and tried to ignore the growing sense of dread. The light pulses of lightning illuminated the entire office, casting eerie shadows that seemed to breathe. I turned my back to it and concentrated on my work. I was writing up a particularly complex entry when all at once, the silence of the storm shattered with a loud crash. My heart thundered in my chest as I turned back to the window, the glass rattled violently. Overhead, darkness loomed, pressed against the walls of the structure while the howling wind twisted into something almost human, calling out to me. Was I losing my mind? I forced myself back to work, but the shadows at the corner of my eye grew more persistent. A flicker here, a silhouette there. Each crack of thunder was accompanied by a resounding whisper that echoed in the silence, urging me to turn and look. Ryan, get out. The voice was soft yet insistent, resonating with a gnawing insistence that tugged at my gut. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and shouted out into the dark office, "Is someone there?" Of course, no one answered. My heart raced as a shiver of true terror coursed through me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed my bag and headed toward the emergency exit, determined to leave. As I turned, I heard a distinct sound, a light laugh that shouldn't have been there, echoing from the corner of the room where the shadows twisted like living things. I froze, every instinct telling me to run. But my curiosity was stronger. I slowly approached the source, heart hammering against my ribcage, only for everything to go dark. The lights flickered back to life, illuminating the stark room, but there was no one there. A chill ran down my spine as I stumbled back to the exit, pushing against the door as panic gripped my throat. It swung open with a release, and I ran. I hurried down the dimly lit hall toward the stairwell, every instinct screaming at me to get to safety. As I descended, I could hear whispers echoing behind me, calling my name in soft tones that felt both familiar and sinister. Ryan, come closer. We're waiting for you. The moment I stepped outside, I was hit with the cold rain. The storm had weakened, but the memory of those whispers lingered like fog. I stumbled into my car, locking the doors and breathing heavily. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something had broken within me that night. Once home, I tossed my bags aside and collapsed on the couch, drenched in cold sweat. I could still hear the whispers, deep in my mind, clawing at me. The next day, I told Marissa what happened, and she looked horrified. Ryan, this isn't normal. You haven't been taking care of yourself. You need to slow down. Your mind is starting to fracture. Her words struck something deep within me, a truth I could no longer deny. For days, I wrestled with the truths that haunted me. I was constantly exhausted, on the verge of collapse, and I had ignored the simplest of all human needs. I began taking small steps. I meditated when I woke, allowing myself just 5 minutes in silence. I swapped coffee for herbal tea, enrolled in a yoga class, and took long walks in the park. The world blossomed before me, each moment unspooling in vibrant color. I felt myself beginning to heal as I took more time to care for who I truly was. I learned to listen to my body, the whispers of the past quieted as my spirit rebuilt itself. Months passed, and I thought I was finally free, until one late evening while cleaning out my office closet, I found an old notebook I used to jot down thoughts. I flipped through it, memories flooding back. But as I read my own handwriting, a chill ran through my body. Scrawled on the last page, in strange slanted letters, were the last words I'd written before that horrid night. I think it's coming for me. I slammed the notebook shut and rushed to my closet, but the shadows twisted again, and for a haunting moment, I felt that warm whisper return. Ryan, come closer. The shadows coiled tighter around me, wrapping their fingers across my mind, but I clenched my jaw, teleporting back to those days where my life had revolved around work. I'd defeated the shadows once, and I would do it again. I allowed the warmth of my self-care routine to wash over me. Each meditation, every yoga class, every hour spent in quiet reflection required a fight against those sinister whispers. The journey had shown me what I truly needed. Not just power, stability, or work, but peace. And now, as I faced the darkness again, I knew that I was stronger than the whispers that haunted me. I discovered the importance of self-care, and I was never going back. I never thought I'd find myself on r/no sleep, sharing my darkest fears, but what happened to me last summer changed everything. If you're looking for an ordinary story about overcoming insecurity in a relationship, you're in the wrong place. You see, my girlfriend Lucy and I had been together for nearly a year when the jealousy demons crept in. It didn't help that she was drop-dead gorgeous. Every time we went out, I felt like the world was judging us, and I was the punchline to a joke no one told. My insecurities twisted my mind into knots, turning simple outings into grueling sessions of self-doubt. One night, my restlessness reached a peak. I lay awake as Lucy slept beside me, her hair shimmering in the pale light that crept through our curtains. The shadows of the room seemed to breathe around me, whispering all my fears back into the air, and before I could talk myself down, the idea hit me like the air from a cold breeze: what if I could erase the competition? Just for a little while. It was a stupid thought, but one that wormed its way into my brain, sneaking past reason and dragging my logic deeper into the darkness. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, I just wanted to feel secure. The next day, I decided to act on my whims. I had a friend I could lean on, Jason. We were inseparable since high school, and he always threw caution to the wind, unlike me. I called him that afternoon, and we met at our usual diner where everything felt familiar and, more importantly, safe. Over a plate of greasy fries and milkshakes, I unloaded all my insecurities. I must have sounded like a madman, rambling about jealous thoughts and irrational fears while Jason nodded and munched on fries, but then his face lit up with a suggestion I never expected. "Why don't we sprinkle a little chaos into your life?" He grinned, and suddenly, a twisted plan was hatched. We'd stage a fake bet, make it look like I was going for someone else while still plugging away at my relationship with Lucy. At first, I thought Jason was joking, but beneath those carefree laughs, I saw a spark of delight in his eyes. Maybe he was onto something. We spent a few days coming up with the plot, crafting good excuse after excuse until the day it came to fruition. Jason would casually tell Lucy I was flirting with some girl he knew from college, letting this rumor float around until it settled in her mind. I didn't realize then how toxic this plan was, that these roots of deceit would spread and choke every genuine feeling I had left. The idea seemed harmless at the time, like a game of puppetry where I could control the strings of our relationship. But as the days passed, my unease began to morph. I noticed little changes in Lucy. The spark in her laughter began to dim, her eyes clouded with a mix of confusion and hurt every time I looked at her. I thought the insecurities were fading, but in truth, they were multiplying like weeds. One evening, after yet another bout of unspoken tension, I decided to confront her. Sitting across from her at our dinner table, I felt the weight of my plan heavy on my conscience. I tossed and turned with how to tell her what had been happening, but the quietness wrapped around us made every second scream louder in my ears. When I finally spoke, the words fell from my lips in labored breaths. I could see her facade cracking, the shock in her eyes pierced me, as did the hurt. "You think I'd leave you for someone else? Why would you even put me through that?" She whispered, her voice trembling like a candle against a chilling breeze. My heart dropped into the pit of my stomach, feeling the guilt twist uncomfortably. For the first time, I noticed the depth of what I had done and how I had fed my insecurity with betrayal. What seemed like a temporary fix had become an irreversible rift, and I sat there, paralyzed by the chaotic consequences of my actions. As the silence enveloped us, the shadows in the corners of the room grew harsher and darker, waiting for my next move. My pulse quickened. I wanted to fix this. I needed to fix this. But the wrong words danced on my tongue, and I couldn't seem to muster the courage to mend the damage. Just when I thought it would remain a night of heartbreaking silence, Lucy surprised me by standing up, wiping away a tear that slipped freely down her cheek, and she walked out into the dimming twilight. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing the chaos of my thoughts inside. I spent that night in agony, flipping through the moments we shared, the laughs, the secrets whispered in the dark, the warmth of her hand clasped in mine. What have I done? I finally understood that this insecurity was manifesting as demons of my own making. If only I had been honest, if only I could have trusted her, we might have fought through together rather than tearing us apart. I made up my mind that I wouldn't let it end like that. The next morning, with the sun barely peeking over the tree line, I leapt out of bed, driven by a sense of urgency. I grabbed my phone, hoping it wouldn't be too late. I texted Lucy, my heart racing as each word left my fingertips. "I'm so sorry for what I've done. Can we talk? I can't lose you." It felt like a gamble, a roll of the dice to test fate. After what felt like an eternity, my phone beeped and her reply shone back at me. "Meet me at the park." Relief washed over me, but fear of the unknown gripped me tighter. We met at our usual spot by the old oak tree, where we had first shared our dreams and fears. As I approached, I could see her standing there, arms crossed, staring at the ground. I fought against the urge to flee, to hide from the wrong I committed. Taking a deep breath, I walked up to her, down on my knees in front of her. "Lucy, I messed up," I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. "I let these fears eat me alive. It was a stupid game, and I lost sight of what we had. I love you more than I can say, and I'm sorry if that's not enough. I'll do anything to make this right." Moments felt like hours as she pondered my words, her gaze flickering between anger and sadness. But then, I saw something shift in her expression. Slowly, she unwound her arms and knelt down in front of me. "You scared me," she confessed, her voice shaking. "I thought I was losing you to someone who wasn't even real." The tears I thought I'd never see again fell freely between us. In that moment, I understood what my insecurity had cost us. I reached for her and she hesitated, but then, like the sun bursting through storm clouds, she took my hands in hers, linking our fingers together as if to anchor us back into reality. It wasn't a quick fix. We spent hours talking, the air heavy with vulnerability and regret as we unraveled the tangled web I had spun. I learned to trust her, to see the love mirrored in her eyes that I had almost lost in my storm of jealousy. We had been tested, but instead of breaking, we rebuilt from our ashes, rising stronger together. Our relationship became a sanctuary instead of a battlefield. I realized overcoming my insecurity didn't mean silencing the shadows, it meant confronting them, accepting the love I was given rather than pushing it away. As the summer sun descended into a golden glow, painting the horizon, I felt the flicker of hope reignite within me. Never underestimate the power of honesty and the strength of love, it has the potential to vanquish even the darkest demons. So here I am, sharing this story not to seek comfort or validation but as a reminder, sometimes, the monsters we battle are born from our own minds, whispering lies that can lead us down perilous paths. If you find yourself caught in a web of insecurities, don't be afraid to talk, don't be afraid to reach out. You never know how one small confession can reshape your reality. The road is rocky and twisted, but hand in hand, you can find your way back into the light, together. I still remember the day I discovered the power of gratitude, not just because it changed my outlook on life but because it unveiled a side of existence that I never knew could coexist with our mundane reality. It all started rather benignly, on a Tuesday like any other, amidst the gray backdrop of a small town tucked away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The morning was uneventful. I made my usual coffee, scrolled through social media, and let the lingering sense of breakfast float around my tiny kitchen. But something felt off that day, a quiet unease that settled in my chest. I was working a dead-end job that barely paid my bills, my relationships felt strained, and everything seemed to blur into a repetitive cycle. After another long day at work, I fell into bed, staring at my ceiling, wondering if life was meant to feel this uninspiring. Then, I had a dream that shook me awake, one that would drive my life in a direction I never anticipated. I found myself in a vast, dark forest, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch into an unfathomable sky. The air crackled with an energy I couldn't explain, and deep within the woods, I saw a shimmering light. Driven by a force beyond my comprehension, I moved toward it. The light grew brighter, pulsating, alive. As I stepped closer, it revealed itself to be a figure, a woman, ethereal and radiant, standing among the trees. She wore a long, flowing gown that floated like mist around her, and her eyes sparkled like stars. "Thank you," she whispered, the words echoing as if the very forest was alive with her gratitude. I blinked, bewildered. "Thank you for what?" I managed to stammer. "For being here," she smiled, and suddenly, the ground at my feet was covered in vibrant flowers, blooming in colors I had never seen before. Each petal seemed to pulse with life, each hue brighter than anything imaginable. "Your presence here is important," she continued. "Your thoughts create your reality, and when you embrace gratitude, it can shift the very fabric of your experience." My heart raced as I tried to process this. Gratitude. How could that possibly change anything? "But I have nothing to be grateful for," I protested, an edge creeping into my voice. "My life is a mess." The woman's eyes softened, and she waved her hand, causing the flowers to bloom further, revealing images from my past. Each flower depicted memories, my first bike ride, laughing with friends, the warm hugs from my mother. "Look closer," she urged, "at what you've forgotten." As I gazed down, faces lit up the flowers, moments flooded my mind. It was as if I had been blind to the beauty that was woven into my life's fabric. "When you nurture gratitude, you cultivate awareness," she said. "What you focus on grows." Do not allow the darkness to blind you from the light. The world around me shifted again, the flowers turned into vibrant butterflies that danced around me in a mystical display. But suddenly, blackness began, creeping at the edges of my vision, a chill running down my spine with each passing second. I sensed something lurking in the shadows, the atmosphere shifting from vibrant joy to sinister dread. Embrace it or be consumed, the woman warned, her voice tense. Panic surged through me. I willed myself to wake up, but the darkness tightened its grip. I felt the cold sting of fear. Remember the light, she urged, her tone thick with urgency. Find gratitude. Just as I felt myself slipping away, I remembered the smallest moments, the warmth of sunlight filtering through the trees, the laughter of friends echoing in the park, my grandmother's comforting smile. I grasped onto those fragments with every ounce of my being, clinging to the light like a lifeline. Suddenly, the darkness receded, and I woke up, gasping for air as if I had been submerged underwater. I was drenched in sweat, heart racing, but I felt different. It was like I was seeing the world anew, colors sharper and sounds clearer. With that jolt came the realization, I needed to change my perspective. I began jotting down things I was grateful for, starting small. A kind stranger holding the door for me, my coworker sharing lunch, the sweet, gentle hum of the coffee machine in the morning. Gradually, those lists filled up, and each gratitude seemed to amplify the mundane until it became extraordinary. I surprised myself when I realized I felt lighter, as if the burden of my worries melted away one acknowledgement at a time. However, the dream woman's warning echoed in my mind. I felt an unsettling presence, like an ever-watchful shadow lurking in the corners of my happiness. I tried to ignore it, pushing away thoughts that hinted at foreboding. But as the weeks passed, it became harder to dismiss. Instances of doubt and negativity began creeping into my newfound haven, hints of anguish slipping into my peaceful state. Connections with friends became strained once more, and old fears resurfaced, bringing whispers of skepticism. The darkness was insidious, pulling at my grateful heart, attempting to claim me again. Yet, I fought back, leaning deeper into my gratitude practice. When I noticed panic building as bills flew in or job prospects dried up, I cataloged each small blessing instead. I made it a ritual, even when the weight of despair pressed down on me, I actively sought out moments of light, and slowly but surely, I noticed the shadows retreating. But the tale doesn't end there. One evening, sitting at my kitchen table, weary from the hustle of the day, I heard an unmistakable sound, a knock at my door. It felt eerily familiar, as if the shadows had come to collect their due. My heart raced as I opened the door to reveal a figure I couldn't recognize, a pale silhouette that glimmered under the dusk light. It was the woman from my dream, a spectral echo of that surreal moment. Her eyes glinted with mischief. "You've been radiating light that draws me in," she said, her voice smooth with an unsettling undertone. "But you don't understand, do you? There are consequences." I felt chills creep along my spine. It was like she drew energy from my gratitude, hungry for more. "I'm here to take what's mine," she said ominously. "The balance must be restored." In that moment, I realized it was my choice. My gratitude had attracted something dark and deceptive. I needed to confront this twisted reflection of my journey. "You have no power over me," I said, my voice steadier than my quaking heart. "I choose to embrace gratitude, even when challenged by darkness." As those words left my lips, the air vibrated with intensity, almost like a ripple disrupting the calm surface of a pond. Her eyes widened, the shadows swirling around her receding as I allowed my gratitude to pulse fiercely from within. A blinding light erupted around me, staving off her ethereal form, illuminating the shadows that had clouded my heart. She screamed, the sound unnervingly shrill, and the darkness dissipated, vanished from my life in a breath of shared warmth. I stood in the silence that followed, the lingering scent of flowers filling my kitchen, a reminder of the beauty I had discovered through every struggle. I quickly slammed the door, locking away the remnants of darkness. That night I penned my gratitude, now clearer and brighter, my journal a testament of resilience, filled with small victories and larger joys. While I still occasionally felt the faint ticks of doubt and despair, they no longer had the same hold over me. The power of gratitude was palpable, but I knew that maintaining that light required vigilance. I had discovered that gratitude wasn't just a fleeting feeling or a trick of the mind, it was an active choice, a lifeline against the shadows of despair racing toward me. And as I lay in bed that night, the weight of the world lifted. I finally understood the truth. The light within is powerful, but it's a candle you must choose to hold up, even against the dark. The day I discovered the power of gratitude was only just the beginning. I want to share something that happened to me recently, something I still can't wrap my head around. I've seen the posts on r/no sleep before, stories that kept me up at night, reading in the dark, the backlit screen casting shadows on my ceiling. This is my attempt to share something deeply personal, yet filled with dread. It started off as any other day. I woke up groggy, surrounded by the familiar chaos of my week-old coffee mugs and piles of laundry that seemed to have taken on a life of their own. I was burnt out, juggling long hours at work, family responsibilities, and my own never-ending expectations, mental exhaustion cascading like a waterfall onto every aspect of my life. But that day, I thought I'd try something new. I'd read about self-care rituals, the kind that supposedly rejuvenate your spirit and help you reconnect with yourself. I knew I needed a change, so I set out to give myself a day to relax, to breathe. The plan was simple: a long bath, some soothing music, maybe even indulge in that book I'd bought months ago but never opened. However, as soon as I stepped into the bathroom, that soothing serenity quickly evaporated, and an eerie sensation washed over me. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination, lit the candles, and filled the tub with hot water, letting the steam envelop me. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and for the first time in forever, let myself drift into what I thought was bliss. Moments blurred, but it wasn't long before the sounds of the outside world began to fade. Just when I thought I was finally relaxing, I heard it, a faint tapping, almost rhythmic in nature, that seemed to call from somewhere within the house. I opened my eyes, heart racing, dismissing it as branches brushing against the window. The calming music I had set on repeat suddenly felt ominous, as if it were warning me of a presence I couldn't detect. I shook off the apprehension, letting the warm water cradle me, but the tapping persisted, growing slightly louder, almost impatient. I steeled myself, unwilling to emerge from my safe haven. I could handle this. I was determined to feel better, to embrace this day fully. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, I finally decided enough was enough. I drained the tub and stepped out, the cool air hitting my damp skin. The moment I wrapped a towel around myself, I felt that deep, unsettling silence of my home. I took a deep breath, trying to summon courage, and padded down the hall toward the source of the tapping sound. It led me, not to a window or door, but to the basement. I hesitated. I'd hardly ventured down there after the last incident with the flooding last winter. I tried to remember why I had even been down there, hoping that my mind wouldn't conjure old fears, but the dread twisted in my stomach like a tightening coil. The tapping continued, almost rhythmic, and my curiosity morphed into a mash of anxiety and intrigue. I flicked on the overhead light, and the basement illuminated in dull, flickering radiance, like a horror movie that hadn't fully started yet. The air was thick and musty, and as I crept down the stairs, the tapping grew louder, clearer now, right against the far wall. My heart thundered against my ribs as I approached what I can only describe as a sheer wall of silence. I stood there for what felt like eternity, staring. Whatever was making that sound was relentless, almost like it was beckoning me, urging me to come closer. With trembling hands, I reached out and pressed a palm against the cold cement wall. A rush of ice shot through me. The moment I did, the tapping stopped, plunging me into an oppressive silence that echoed in my mind. Panic set in, and I jerked my hand back, irrationally afraid of whatever might lie behind that wall. I turned to retreat, but before I could reach the stairs, the wall shuddered. I froze, a primal instinct rising. Something was on the other side, so close, yet infinitely far. I barely had time to turn around when I heard it, a voice, a whisper, flowing through the cracks of that wall, "Help me." It sent chills ripping through my body. I could barely process what I had just heard. Who was that? What did it mean? The walls felt alive, pulsing with an energy that resonated in my bones. I stumbled backward, bumping into a shelf stacked with boxes, but my thoughts raced too fast, drowning out the sudden clatter. "Help me." The voice was almost pleading now, tinged with desperation, as if whatever was there needed me, and at that moment, I realized I was still trapped in my cycle of neglect, my mind's debris cluttering the corners of my existence, as if I were a prisoner in my house, in my life, consumed by chaos. Whatever had been tapping at my heart was now manifesting in a way I could no longer ignore. "Help me." I clutched my head, torn between wanting to flee and needing to understand. In that moment, clarity hit me like a ton of bricks. I had ignored myself for far too long, and now I stood at the precipice of the unknown, wanting to escape from something that had perhaps been crying for recognition all along. Fear swallowed me whole, and I turned on my heel, racing back upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't look back as I pressed my back against it, chest heaving. I sank to the floor and buried my head in my hands, a tide of emotions crashing over me like dark waves. It was a terrifying reminder that neglecting my needs was a choice that had consequences, and I was witnessing the manifestation of my own despair. After what felt like hours, I finally gathered the courage to face it again, but when I returned downstairs, the silence was deafening. No tapping, no whispers, just emptiness. It struck me then, the realization that self-care was not just about pampering myself for a day, it was an ongoing commitment to acknowledge my needs, my fears, my true self, something I had been avoiding out of a sense of duty and panic. I knew I had to confront whatever lingered in the shadows of that basement, not for it to find peace, but for me to reclaim my own. That day marked the beginning of a journey I never anticipated. I didn't visit that basement again. Instead, I focused on what I truly needed to heal. I sought therapy, rediscovered joys I had cast aside, and began to embrace my fears instead of running from them. The tapping became a metaphor for the voices within that begged for recognition, and with every step I took towards self-care, I felt lighter. I no longer see that whispering voice as a threat but as a call to acknowledge the fragments of myself I had neglected. Over time, I learned self-care isn't simply a day of relaxation, it's about creating space for my spirit to breathe, to exist in fullness, and to connect with my inner self. So, if you ever think you can just push everything aside because life is too chaotic, remember this: there's a weight to ignoring your own cries for help, and sometimes it may materialize in ways you could never have imagined. Embrace your darkness, listen to the tapping, and you might just find light. I've never been one to share personal stories, especially the ones that make you cringe in retrospect, but there's something about this experience that still haunts me. I can't shake the memories of that day, the most embarrassing moment of my life, a moment that not only changed my reputation but also the way I view the world around me. It all started during my senior year of high school, in the spring semester. Our school had an annual talent show, and I had decided to showcase my passion, magic tricks. I had spent weeks preparing, practicing sleight of hand and perfecting my favorite illusion. When the day finally arrived, I was riddled with nerves, but it was also exciting. My friends had gathered to support me, and I felt ready to dazzle everyone with my grand finale, a trick I had seen that involved making a person vanish. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation, filled with students and teachers alike, all eager to see what talents their peers would unveil. I went on stage, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I did some basic tricks to warm up the audience, but the highlight was supposed to be my final act. I had convinced my best friend, Jeremy, to assist me. He was always a good sport, and I thought it would be a magical moment for us both. I positioned him in a large box, announced my disappearing act, and with a flourish of my cape, I pulled the curtain closed. My heart raced as I got into the rhythm of my performance, going through the motions like I had rehearsed. I built up the suspense, waving my wand, chanting and performing all the dramatic flair that I could muster. Then I whipped open the curtain, ready to reveal an empty box. For a second, there was just a stunned silence as the audience processed what they thought they just saw. But then it hit me: Jeremy was still in the box, looking confused and a bit terrified. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to think of what to do next. I was supposed to be the magician, the master of illusion, and now I was the fool standing in front of 1,000 eyes, dead silent except for the growing laughter echoing through the crowd. I stammered, trying to recover, but all I could do was awkwardly fumble with the props until Jeremy, seeing my desperation, called out, "Hey, I'm still here." The laughter escalated. My face burned. I had to think fast. In a desperate attempt to salvage the act, I improvised, waving my hands and attempting to lift the box dramatically. But instead, I ended up knocking it over completely. It toppled over, wooden panels splintering, and Jeremy tumbled out, landing in a heap. The audience erupted into a chorus of roars and howls, the kind that would drown out any hope of regaining control. Mortified, I rushed to help him up, but the damage was done. My name became synonymous with disaster that night. As we left the stage, my mind spiraled with humiliation. My friends tried to console me, and for a moment, I thought I could brush it off as just a funny story. But When I returned to school the following Monday, it was like walking through a minefield. Every corner I turned, I could hear whispers. "You're the magician," they'd say, bursting into laughter. I catch snippets of conversations, every one of them retelling the story of my failure, each more exaggerated than the last. It wasn't just the students, even some of the teachers joined in on the fun, chuckling to themselves. I felt like a pariah. I began avoiding the cafeteria, the hallways, even the gym. I had worked so hard to make my mark before graduation, and now it felt like my biggest legacy was going to be a colossal failure. Just as I was starting to believe that maybe I could endure this, something worse happened. One afternoon, after school, as I was gathering my things, I overheard a group of popular boys talking about the talent show. They were showing videos on their phones and laughing. My heart sank as I realized they were sharing a clip of the incident. My embarrassment streamed online without my permission. I was horrified, my face instantly flushed as I heard my voice screaming along with the laughter of the crowd. "Just look at him," one of them said, pointing at the screen. "You gotta love a magician who can't even make his friend disappear." I bolted out of there, feeling sick. That moment felt like the death knell for any semblance of a normal senior year. I withdrew from everything, skipping out on events, and stopped hanging out with friends. Instead, I spent hours in my room replaying the incident in my mind, continually wincing at the absurdity of it all. I'd become a recluse, unable to shake the crippling embarrassment that clouded my thoughts. However, just when I thought I was destined to end my high school career as a joke, things took a turn I hadn't expected. A few weeks later, I received a direct message on social media from a girl named Lydia, someone I had known casually but never talked to. She invited me to a local coffee shop where she said she wanted to chat. I was apprehensive, but the thought of being seen as nothing more than that magician started to wear on me. Some part of me craved a real connection, free of judgment and laughter. So, I agreed. When I arrived, she smiled warmly, and we started chatting. She mentioned the talent show incident as if it was just a funny story. "Honestly, I loved your act," she admitted. "You turned an embarrassing moment into something memorable, and that takes guts." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. We talked for hours, sharing laughs and stories, and within a few days, we began hanging out regularly. Eventually, I told her everything, the shame and anxiety that had overwhelmed me since that day. To my surprise, she didn't laugh or mock me. Instead, she shared her own embarrassing moments, and right in that moment, I realized we all had our moments of vulnerability, sometimes even more embarrassing than mine. Through her, I found solace. Whatever heat of embarrassment I had felt transformed into something manageable. We ended up becoming close friends, and all those memories of the cruel laughter faded. I learned to face my fears head-on, to tackle my vulnerability instead of hiding from it. Through this experience, I discovered that sometimes, the only way to face the fallout of embarrassment is not to shield yourself away but to step into the light, where you can find others who understand. In time, I worked up the courage to hit the stage again, this time for an open mic night where I told my story with humor, capturing the mishap that had once haunted me and making others laugh with me instead of at me. The once dreaded moment turned into a point of connection, and as I walked off the stage that night, the wave of applause drowned out any echoes of shame that had lingered for so long. I realized that sometimes the most embarrassing moment of your life can be the seed of the greatest friendships and the most profound personal growth. When I learned to appreciate my parents' sacrifices, it was not through some heartwarming moment over a family dinner or a sappy television show. No, it was a dark, desperate time that forced me to confront the weight of their struggles and the extent of their love. I always thought I had a typical middle-class upbringing. I attended school, went to soccer practice, and spent Saturdays lazing around, playing video games while my parents bustled about with their daily routines. They worked hard, but I never really grasped the magnitude of their sacrifices. It was during my sophomore year of college, a time when the world finally started feeling big and overwhelming, that everything changed. I had just finished a particularly rough week filled with exams and an exhausting part-time job, and on that fateful Friday night, I decided to hit a local bar with my friends to blow off steam. That's when I received the call, the kind that throttles your insides like a vice. My mom's voice trembled on the other end, a mixture of fear and sadness rippling through her words. Dad had been in a car accident, they were taking him to the hospital, and I needed to come home. The drive back felt like a fever dream, hours stretching as I replayed memories of my dad, the way he threw me in the air when I was little, the stories he told each night before bed, how he taught me to ride a bike with nothing but patience and that unmistakable grin of his. I arrived at the hospital, heart racing, and I'll spare you the gruesome details, but we didn't know if he was going to make it. It was a blur of sterile rooms and waiting areas filled with anxious faces. I sat, pacing, my fingers digging into my skin, wondering how this could happen to such a good man. The doctors did everything they could, and after an agonizing 24 hours, they finally let us see him, bandaged, bruised, but alive. That night, as I sat in his hospital room, I tried to wrap my head around what had happened. It should have been a simple drive, but it was a reminder of how fragile life is, and I couldn't help but resent the universe a little for putting us in this situation. Days passed, and as he slowly recovered, we talked more. At first, it was about trivial things, and then, somehow, the conversation turned to sacrifices. Dad recounted stories from his own childhood, growing up in a poor neighborhood, working multiple jobs to pay for college, the struggles my grandparents faced as immigrants looking for a better life. Each tale seemed to tether me closer, connecting the dots between his past and the life I had inherited, a life infused with countless unseen sacrifices. I listened, and the weight of it all began to flood over me. I realized that every time he had insisted I should focus on my studies, it wasn't just parental nagging, it was his attempt to ensure that I wouldn't have to face the same struggles he did, that I might find a way to climb higher, beyond their sacrifices. The layers of their love, unpeeled one by one, revealed a depth I had often taken for granted. My parents had worked endless hours, seldom indulging, saving every dime for my education, worrying silently about bills while still managing to put a plate of food on the table and a smile on their faces. I saw their financial struggles in a different light, no longer just a matter of numbers but representative of their unwavering love for me. They fought through their own pain to nurture my growth, encouraging my dreams while silently burying their own disappointments. The more we talked, the more I began to see my own life as a tapestry woven with their sacrifices. A small harrowing incident happened one night, while I was at home caring for my dad during his recovery. Half asleep on the couch beside him, I was awoken by a sudden cough, only to witness him fumbling for his medication that he had clumsily dropped on the floor. I rushed to his aid, but as I kneeled, I caught a glimpse of his weary eyes. It dawned on me, every ache and pain he had was a product of years spent toiling for our family, yet here he was, determined to show up for me, even in his fragile state. In that moment, it was like a storm broke inside me. I gripped his hand tightly, this time not out of fear but to ground myself in the present, in the recognition of all he had sacrificed. The next weekend, after he was discharged, I returned to campus, but everything felt different. Instead of scrolling through social media or zoning out in classes, I was stirred by an urgency to reach out. I called my mom, thanking her for juggling work, the home, everything so beautifully, often while I was oblivious to how demanding it really was. I promised to come home more, to genuinely listen, to be present. I began volunteering in community service, realizing that there were countless families like mine, whose stories stayed buried beneath layers of daily struggles. I took those journeys home more frequently, sometimes just to sit in the kitchen with my parents as they cooked, savoring every laugh, every moment. We might not have much in terms of material wealth, but I arrived at a realization that our family was richer than most in love and resilience. Eventually, I returned to university, transformed. My grades improved, yes, but more importantly, I was less distracted by the trivialities of college life. I found new purpose in achieving my dreams, not just for myself but also for my parents, to honor the sacrifices they made. When I walked across the stage at graduation, I searched for them in the crowd, and instead of just acknowledging their efforts in a speech, I planned to take them on a trip, a promise I kept. Looking back, the accident was a stark moment that unveiled the complexities of love within sacrifice. A veil had been lifted, allowing me to appreciate everything my parents endured. It wasn't just a wake-up call, it was a rebirth of sorts, a realization that life is not about living for oneself, but about embracing the opportunities in every experience. Now, my parents are my beacon. They remind me that to appreciate truly means to understand the depths from which love arises, and now I live my life not just for myself but for them, always. I share this not just to recount that harrowing time but to inspire anyone who feels distant from their family. Listen, truly listen, you might discover the sacrifices and the love that bind you together are far greater than you ever imagined. A night out that went terribly wrong, the aftermath. A night out that went terribly wrong started innocently enough with a casual text from my friend Jason suggesting we grab drinks at a new bar downtown. It was one of those spur-of-the-moment decisions that seemed harmless, a quick escape from the monotony of the work week. I'd been feeling cooped up lately, buried in deadlines and routine, so the idea of loosening up a bit, laughing over a few beers with Jason, sounded like exactly what I needed. We met up around 9 at this dimly lit spot called The Hideout, a place that had only opened recently but was already famous for its strange decor and even stranger clientele. Jason was waiting for me by the bar, grinning as he raised his glass in a mock toast, already 2 drinks in by the time I got there. The night began as a blur of laughter, stories, and drinks. It felt like one of those nights that would be ordinary, maybe even forgettable, a few hours of escape in the midst of life's grind. But then Jason started talking about this party he'd heard about, a secret rave a few blocks away. I didn't know it at the time, but saying yes to that suggestion would be a mistake, the kind of mistake that changes you forever. We stumbled out of the bar and down a series of side streets, following vague directions Jason had picked up from some guy he'd met at the bar. The city felt unusually quiet, and as we moved away from the main streets, the buildings around us seemed to grow taller, looming over us in a way that felt eerie in the night silence. We finally found ourselves standing in front of an unmarked door, behind which loud, pulsing music thumped like a heartbeat, shaking the walls. I should have listened to that small voice in the back of my head telling me to turn back, but instead, I followed Jason inside, the thrill of the unknown urging me forward. The room we entered was dark, with flashing neon lights and shadows cast everywhere, distorted faces and bodies blending into the crowd, all moving to the rhythm. There was something off about the energy in the room, an edge of desperation in the way people were dancing, like they were losing themselves, escaping reality in a way that felt too intense, too all-consuming. Jason disappeared into the crowd almost immediately, leaving me stranded among strangers who seemed to look right through me, their faces glazed over, empty in a way I couldn't quite place. I tried to find him, pushing through the crowd, calling his name, but the music drowned out everything else, pulsing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside my head. The smell of sweat and smoke filled the air, and the longer I stayed, the more claustrophobic I felt, trapped in a place that seemed to pulse with some unspoken dread. Just as I was about to give up and head out, someone grabbed my arm, their grip too tight, pulling me through the crowd. I turned, expecting to see Jason or maybe someone trying to be friendly, but it was a man I'd never seen before, his face half lit by the neon lights, his eyes wide and frantic. He leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper over the music, saying something about leaving, about how it wasn't safe. I tried to pull away, thinking he was just some drunk guy, but he held on, his grip tightening as he repeated himself, his words tinged with an urgency that cut through the fog of the night. You need to get out. This place isn't what you think it is. He looked over his shoulder, his face paling as he glanced at something behind him, his eyes widening in fear. They're watching. With that, he let go of me, melting back into the crowd before I could ask what he meant. I was shaken, the initial thrill of the night giving way to a creeping sense of dread that settled in my gut. I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of the people around me, their faces strange and unfamiliar, their expressions vacant yet intense. The energy in the room had shifted, and it felt like everyone was moving in sync, like puppets on strings, their movements too perfect, too coordinated. I tried to find the exit, but the more I searched, the more disoriented I felt, the lights and shadows warping my sense of direction. It was like the walls were closing in, the room shifting in a way that defied logic, every path I took leading me further into the crowd. I finally spotted Jason near the back, his face pale, his eyes wide as he stood frozen, staring at something just out of view. I pushed my way over to him, calling his name, but he didn't respond, his gaze fixed on whatever he was looking at, his body tense, almost paralyzed. I followed his line of sight, my stomach dropping as I realized what he was staring at, a group of people, standing in a perfect circle, their heads bowed, whispering in a language I didn't recognize. The sound was low, rhythmic, almost like a chant, filling the air with an unnatural chill. I grabbed Jason's arm, shaking him, trying to snap him out of it, but he didn't move, his expression vacant, like he was in a trance. Panic set in, my heart racing as I looked around, realizing that more people were gathering, forming circles all around us, their voices joining the whispering chant. The sound grew louder, filling my head, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I felt trapped, like I was being pulled into something dark and ancient, something that defied explanation. I yanked Jason's arm harder, finally breaking him out of his trance, and together we stumbled through the crowd, pushing our way toward what I hoped was the exit. The whispers followed us, the sound echoing in my mind, even as we burst out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. We didn't stop running until we were blocks away, the silence of the empty streets a stark contrast to the suffocating noise we'd left behind. Jason was shaking, his face pale, and when I asked him what he'd seen, he just shook his head, unable to put it into words. We never talked about that night again, and neither of us dared to go back to that part of town. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the whispers, that low, rhythmic chant echoing in my mind, a haunting reminder of the night that went terribly wrong, a night that left a mark on both of us, one that would never fade. When I faced rejection and surprised myself, I always told myself that I was prepared for rejection, that it was just a part of life. But when the moment came, it hit me like a cold wave of dread, leaving me breathless. It all started at the end of last summer. I was living in my cramped studio apartment, drowning in the noise of the traffic below while my roommate was away. I had just finished my final year of college and was about to apply for my dream job. I had worked tirelessly for the past 4 years, and in my mind, if I put together the right cover letter and resume, there was no way I could fail. As the weeks rolled on, I tirelessly tailored my application, hoping it would grab their attention. But on the day I hit send, that familiar knot of anxiety twisted in my stomach. It took nearly a month before I got the email. I was out at the grocery store when I saw it flash across my phone. I didn't even bother to finish checking out. I rushed home, heart racing. When I got to my apartment, I opened the email, and that's when it happened. "We regret to inform you." Followed by a series of corporate fluff about how they appreciated my interest but had chosen another candidate. I prepared myself for disappointment. I'm not someone who crumbles at rejection. But this felt different. It tore through me. I tossed my phone aside, my stomach in knots, and threw myself onto the couch. I found myself staring at the wall, questioning everything, struggling to breathe. Moments felt like hours as I spiraled deeper into self-doubt. At that moment, all I could think about was how I had invested so much time and energy into something so painfully out of reach. It was like I'd opened a door in my mind to a room filled with all my failures, and I couldn't look away. But then something inside flickered, a rebellious urge, a need to prove that I could rise again. I grabbed a pen and paper, and for the first time, I began to write down my feelings, capturing the hurt, the anger, and ultimately, the determination I felt. I started writing a short story, pouring myself into it, transferring all my fear and disappointment onto the page, like casting a spell to ward off the gloom that threatened to swallow me whole. Day by day, the pages filled up with my pains and triumphs, blending reality with fantasy, creating a world entirely separate from my own. I was lost in the thrill of creation, so engrossed in crafting my story that I lost track of time. It became an incredible escape from the despair that had settled in my heart, my tale morphing into something more potent than mere therapy. This was empowerment. The months slipped by, and with each passing week, I polished and honed my story until it felt complete. It was a surreal experience, like I had resurrected a piece of myself I didn't even know was missing. I decided to share it on a writing platform where other aspiring writers gathered. Heart racing, I posted my work and prepared for immediate feedback. The next couple of weeks were filled with comments, and to my shock, it gained traction. As the days passed, the likes and positive reviews began to skyrocket, winning the hearts of readers who resonated with the themes of rejection and resilience. Comments flooded in, telling me my story connected with them on a level they hadn't anticipated. I couldn't believe the warmth of encouragement pouring through my screen. It felt surreal. People I had never met were telling me how much my words meant to them and how they, too, had faced rejection and fought their way back. And as more readers found my story, something amazing happened. I connected with a community of writers and readers who uplifted each other, supporting one another's artistic journeys. This thriving network motivated me to brush up my skills further. I even began collaborating with other authors and shared workshops to help aspiring writers hone their craft. I felt like a phoenix reborn from the ashes of rejection, and it was exhilarating. Months later, I was surprised to receive a message from a small indie publishing house interested in turning my short story into a full novel. They had discovered my writing through the platform where I had posted. They wanted to know if I was interested in expanding my piece into something larger. It took every ounce of restraint not to scream in disbelief. I found that irony delicious. Rejection had birthed a harvest of creativity that had led to this opportunity. I spent months crafting my manuscript, channeling every ounce of personal struggle and triumph into my writing, and when it was finally published, I felt a surge of accomplishment. I had done it. The cover of my book bore my name, and readers who had once only expressed their support now actually held something of mine in their hands. I chuckled when I thought back to how dismal the future had appeared after receiving that rejection letter. It was a subtle reminder that sometimes, we need to face our shadows, to let them haunt us just a little before we can seize our light and resist the urge to hide. And with that, I had learned that rejection was not a dead-end road but rather a detour, a winding path leading to unforeseen opportunities. I hadn't just faced rejection, I had transformed it, reshaping that pain into fuel for my passion. So if you're ever in a place where the weight of rejection feels unbearable, remember, sometimes, it's only when we confront our sorrows head-on that we surprise ourselves, and perhaps, even find the strength to rewrite our stories. I was shunned by my family for choosing my passion. I still remember the day I told them, sitting around the dinner table with that uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. My mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling as she asked if I was serious, if I had truly made up my mind. My father wouldn't even look at me. My siblings sat there, eyes down, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. I had spent years suppressing my dreams, working in the family business, trying to be the son they wanted, the son who would carry on the legacy and make them proud. But it was suffocating, like being trapped in a life that wasn't mine, a life built on expectations that I'd never wanted for myself. So, when I finally told them that I was leaving, that I was done following their rules, their plans, their dreams, the air turned thick with tension, and I could feel their disappointment like a weight pressing down on me. They thought I was throwing my life away, abandoning everything they'd built, everything they'd sacrificed to give me, for something they saw as a foolish hobby, a fleeting obsession. But it wasn't a hobby to me, it was everything I'd ever wanted, the only thing that made me feel alive. I thought they'd understand, thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd support me, even if they didn't fully agree. But I was wrong. That night, my father told me that if I left, I was no longer part of the family, that I was dead to them. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I could feel my heart breaking, splintering under the weight of his anger and disappointment. My mother just cried, begging me to reconsider, to think about what I was giving up. My siblings sat in silence, their faces blank, their eyes refusing to meet mine. It was like I'd become a stranger, an outsider in my own home. When I packed my bags, there were no goodbyes, no tearful farewells. They just watched as I walked out the door, their faces cold, unfeeling. I tried to convince myself that they'd come around, that they'd see how happy I was, how much this meant to me, but as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the silence from them became deafening. They didn't call, didn't write, didn't check in to see if I was okay. It was like I'd never existed. I threw myself into my passion, working day and night, determined to prove them wrong, to show them that this wasn't a phase, that this was what I was meant to do. But no matter how much success I found, no matter how many milestones I reached, there was always this emptiness, this ache that reminded me of what I'd lost, of the family I'd left behind. I'd see them sometimes, in passing, walking down the street or at the grocery store, but they'd look right through me, like I was a ghost, a shadow of someone they used to know. The pain was unbearable, this feeling of being invisible, of being nothing more than a memory they'd chosen to erase. Then one night, I got a call from my sister, the first time I'd heard her voice in over a year. She sounded scared, her voice trembling as she told me that something was wrong, that our father was sick, that he didn't have much time left. My heart sank, the pain of the past year rushing back in a wave of guilt and regret. I wanted to go to him, to be there for him, to tell him that I was sorry, that I'd never meant to hurt him. But when I showed up at the hospital, my mother looked at me with a hatred I'd never seen before. She told me that I wasn't welcome, that I had no right to be there, that I'd given up my place in the family the day I'd walked out that door. I tried to explain, tried to make her understand that I was still their son, that I still loved them, but she wouldn't listen. She told me that I was selfish, that I'd broken their hearts, that I'd torn the family apart with my choices. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of her words, her anger, her bitterness. My siblings wouldn't even look at me, their faces blank, cold, like they didn't know me. I was alone, standing in that sterile hospital hallway, the sounds of machines and distant voices echoing around me, and I realized that I had truly lost them, that they had cast me out, that I was nothing to them. In that moment, I felt a darkness settle over me, a hollow emptiness that I knew would never go away. I walked out of that hospital feeling like a part of me had died, like I'd lost a piece of my soul that I'd never get back. I went back to my life, to my passion, to the thing that had given me purpose, but it felt empty, meaningless. I'd spent so long trying to prove myself, trying to show them that I was more than their expectations, but in the end, I'd lost everything that had ever mattered to me. I don't know if I'll ever see them again, don't know if they'll ever forgive me. But I do know that the pain of being shunned, of being cast out by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. And every night, as I lie awake, haunted by memories of the family I once had, I wonder if it was all worth it, if following my passion was worth the price I paid. I can't believe I'm about to share this, but I feel like I need to tell my story, mostly because no one would believe it if I didn't. Every single word I'm about to write is true, and if you're reading this, you might want to just buckle up and get cozy. My partner, Alex, was struggling with something that none of my friends or family could truly understand. It started off small enough, with Alex seeming a little more withdrawn each day, but as time went on, there was a noticeable shift. I'd come home from work, and instead of the warm smile I was used to, there was just silence. It was like living in a house without echoes. I tried everything I could think of, cozy movie nights, elaborate dinners, and heartfelt conversations about feelings, but nothing seemed to break through the fog of despair that had enveloped them. I did some research, diving into articles about anxiety and depression, trying to arm myself with knowledge. But although I meant well, my attempts always fell flat. It was clear that something deeper and darker was lurking below the surface, something they didn't want to say out loud. Then it happened, one rainy Tuesday evening when all the world seemed dreary and gray. I was cooking dinner when I heard a soft sobbing coming from our bedroom. It was quiet, almost as if the tears were embarrassed to break the still air. I rushed in, and Alex was curled up under the covers, their shoulders shaking. I asked what was wrong, but they just told me to leave them alone. As hard as it was, I respected that, sitting silently on the edge of the bed as they cried. Minutes turned into hours, and finally, they managed to choke out a single sentence, "I can't do this anymore." My heart sank. That sentence felt like a death knell, echoing through my mind. I needed to do something to help them, but what? As I sat there, an idea began to form. What if I tried to bring a little light into the darkness? So the next day, I started a project. I wanted to create a little haven of positivity in our home. I dusted off our old craft supplies, stuff we'd rarely touched since moving in together. I started making a collage, a literal collage, of all the things I knew Alex loved, pictures of their family, memories from our vacations, illustrations of their favorite movies, songs written down that gave them comfort. I even added little quotes about hope and resilience that I hoped would resonate. I worked late into the night and even burned my fingers a little while hot gluing everything together, but every moment felt like it was worth it. When I finished, I felt like I had created something truly magical. I took it to their bedroom and gently placed it on the wall opposite the bed. "Alex, come look at this," I said, heart racing. At first, they only glanced at it, eyes still heavy with tears. But slowly, they started to take it in. I watched as their expression transformed from confusion to curiosity, then finally to a fragile smile. They approached the wall like it was a sacred display and traced the edges of the collage with shaking fingers. "Did you really do this for me?" they asked, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, fighting back my own tears. In that moment, something shifted in Alex's gaze, a flicker of hope ignited. From that point, they began to engage a little more, sharing their feelings, worries, and fears. One afternoon, in a particularly vulnerable moment, Alex opened up about their struggles with a past trauma that had haunted them. It was incredibly difficult for them to talk about, but they shared it anyway. I listened. I was a rock, steadfast and unwavering, and in time, I felt them starting to thaw out from the cold grip of despair. I organized small outings, a walk in the park, visits to our favorite ice cream shop, or even just watching the sunset on our balcony. Each little moment became a thread weaving us closer together. One Friday night, we set up our living room for a cozy movie marathon, complete with popcorn and fairy lights draped everywhere. It was fun and lighthearted, just two people enjoying each other's company. But midway through our favorite film, I noticed a change. Alex's eyes grew dark, and they suddenly looked distant. Panic gripped me. I reached over, placing a gentle hand on their arm, and asked them what was wrong. They jerked slightly, and I could see tears welling up again. I thought I had taken 10 steps backward. I didn't know what to do. But then they took a deep breath and opened up about how they sometimes felt guilty for dragging me into their struggles. "I want to be better for you, for us," they said, voice breaking. I didn't know how to respond, so I did the only thing I could. I pulled them into a hug, feeling all of their pain and fear seep into my skin. "You don't have to be better for me," I whispered. "You just have to be you." That night, we sat together, talking until the early hours. I listened, and they shared, and as the hours passed, the heaviness in the air felt a little lighter. It wasn't a cure, but it was progress. We moved slowly, some days were harder than others, but it felt like we were finally making our way through the fog, and I was grateful just to walk that path with them. Just when I thought we were on the right track, something unimaginable happened. A few weeks later, late one night, I heard a strange sound coming from the bathroom. It was a soft whimpering that seeped into my dreams like an unwanted fog. I leapt out of bed, heart racing, and rushed to see what was going on. When I burst through the door, I found Alex on the floor, seemingly in some sort of trance as they cradled something in their hands. As I got closer, my stomach sank. In their lap lay the remnants of the collage, the beautiful work I had put so much love into, torn apart and scattered. I felt as if the ground had shifted under my feet. "What happened?" I asked, voice shaking. Alex looked up at me, eyes wild and distraught. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. It was just too much, all the memories and pressure." They dropped the pieces, and I could see the regret flooding their features. "I can't do this. I can't handle being happy, it feels wrong. I'm so messed up." The chaos of it all sparked anger inside of me, anger I didn't know I had. But it was quickly subdued by the overwhelming sadness I felt for Alex. I rushed to gather the pieces, frantic, and as I did, an idea struck me, a dangerous one. "Okay," I said softly but firmly, "if it's too much, let's take it apart, piece by piece. We'll revisit those memories, and you can tell me why they're hard for you. It'll be our healing process." Their breath caught. I could see the hesitation in their eyes, but I pressed on. "Let's do it together, and we can build it again, this time, with everything you're feeling, and we'll make it stronger. I'll be here with you." For a long, tense moment, Alex searched my face as if looking for something, answers, hope, or maybe even permission. Then, slowly, they nodded. I dropped everything and sat beside them on the cold bathroom floor. One by one, we peeled back the layers of memories from the collage, each piece sparking a story. Some were poignant, some dark, but every one was woven with threads of truth. It was raw and painful, but it needed to happen. I stayed there, wrapped in the weight of their journey, listening intently as they shared memories they had buried deep, a lost pet, broken friendships, moments they felt unworthy of love. Hours flew by as we talked, barely taking pauses to breathe. I could see the tension slowly melting off Alex's shoulders as they shared, and the more pieces we uncovered, the more they looked like the person I had fallen in love with. Finally, as dawn began to break, we looked at everything we had pulled apart, and I sat back, wiping tears from my cheeks. "Now, what's next?" I asked softly, mentally exhausted but exhilarated. Alex stared at the piles of memories, and then they looked at me, a flicker of that old spark returning to their eyes. "We put it back together, but this time we'll add a new piece, hope." They grabbed some blank papers, and together we began to fill them with colorful drawings, words of encouragement, and symbols of our journey. Soon, the collage transformed from a simple collection of memories into a vibrant testament to resilience. Each layer held stories of pain and healing woven into one. By sunup, we had rebuilt it, stronger than it was before, and Alex looked amazed at what we had created. In that moment, I knew we weren't free of the struggles that faced us, and the road to healing would be long. But as we sat there, exhausted yet more connected than ever, I realized something profound. I wasn't just helping my partner through a tough time, we were two souls navigating a storm together, learning to dance in the rain as we built our sanctuary from the chaos that life threw our way. And while I may have come up with that collage initially, it was Alex who was truly the artist, and together we were creating a masterpiece of our story. My neighbor's secret life, I never expected this. My neighbor's secret life, I never expected this. From the moment I moved into the quiet suburb, my neighbor Joe was the last person I thought would ever become a point of intrigue. He was the picture of normality, middle-aged, graying hair, glasses that slipped down his nose, and a meticulously mowed lawn. His house was an immaculate, single-story, cookie-cutter suburban home with the classic white picket fence, and every morning at 7:30 sharp, he'd be out there watering his flowers with that same steady hand and blank expression. Over the months, we exchanged the typical small talk, occasional nods, and awkward neighborly smiles, but nothing beyond that. Joe seemed to live an ordinary, uneventful life, that is, until the night I heard the sounds. It was around midnight when I first noticed it, strange thuds coming from Joe's backyard, followed by what sounded like muffled voices. I told myself it was nothing, probably a raccoon or maybe Joe moving something heavy, but the sounds continued night after night. Curiosity ate at me. On the fifth night, I finally decided to peek through the gap in my curtains, catching a glimpse of Joe under the dim glow of his porch light. He was dragging something large and bulky across his backyard toward the shed. The figure looked human-sized, covered in what seemed like a thick black tarp. My heart pounded as I watched him struggle to get it through the shed door before disappearing inside. I didn't sleep that night, my mind spiraling with possibilities, trying to convince myself it was just an old rug or maybe some broken furniture, but deep down, I felt something was wrong. The next morning, I casually brought up the noise to Joe when I saw him outside, hoping he'd offer some mundane explanation, but he just smiled in that unsettlingly blank way and said, "Must be the wind." I brushed it off, trying to resume life as normal, but things only got stranger. Every night, around midnight, Joe would perform his ritual, dragging something new to the shed, sometimes covered in black tarp, other times in what looked like burlap sacks. I tried to convince myself he was just a quirky guy with weird habits, but then came the incident that pushed me over the edge. One night, unable to sleep, I stood by my bedroom window, watching his movements, when suddenly, his head jerked up. He looked directly at my window, like he knew I was there, even though I'd been standing in the dark. I quickly backed away, my heart racing, but the next morning, I found a handwritten note slipped under my door. "Some things are best left unseen." My hands shook as I read it. Was he threatening me? Warning me? I couldn't tell, but it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to avoid Joe after that, but every encounter felt heavier, his casual smiles masking something far more sinister. I considered calling the police, but I had no real evidence, just paranoia and a gut feeling. Then, one evening, I was walking past his house when I noticed something strange about his car. The trunk was slightly ajar, and from the gap, I could see a flash of what looked like dark-stained fabric, and a heavy, metallic scent filled the air. I forced myself to keep walking, but every fiber of my being screamed that something was very, very wrong. Days passed, and I found myself obsessively watching his house. The shed became the center of my fixation. Why was he so secretive about it? Why only go there at night? Desperate for answers, I made a plan. Late one night, when the entire street was dark and silent, I snuck into his backyard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I crept toward the shed, trying the handle, but it was locked. Just as I was about to leave, I spotted a small, dusty window on the side. I peered through it, squinting to make out the shapes inside. My heart nearly stopped. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings, all detailing missing persons cases from the surrounding area, some dating back years. Pictures of smiling faces, red strings connecting them, and handwritten notes filled the space. And in the center of the shed was a chair, chains bolted to its arms and legs, stained with something dark. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat, my mind racing. I had to get out of there, to call the police, to do something. But just as I turned to leave, I froze. Joe was standing there, no more than a few feet away, his face illuminated by the dim moonlight. He didn't look surprised. In fact, he looked calm, as if he'd been expecting me all along. "Couldn't resist, could you?" he said, his voice as cold as ice. I stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, an apology, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He stepped closer, blocking my path to the gate, his eyes never leaving mine. "I warned you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Panic surged through me as I tried to push past him, but his grip was like iron, his hands cold and unyielding. I don't remember exactly how I broke free, only that I found myself stumbling back to my house, locking every door and window behind me. I stayed up all night, waiting for the knock on the door, for the sound of him breaking in, but it never came. The next day, I went to the police, desperate to report what I'd seen, but without concrete evidence, they were reluctant to believe me. They agreed to do a welfare check, but when they returned, they told me the shed was empty, no chair, no clippings, nothing. They looked at me like I was crazy, like I'd made the whole thing up. I couldn't believe it. Joe had cleared everything out in the span of a few hours, leaving no trace behind. In the days that followed, Joe acted as though nothing had happened. He'd wave to me from his yard, that same eerie smile plastered on his face, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. I started avoiding my own house, spending nights at friends' places, jumping at every creak and shadow. The paranoia became unbearable. One day, a small package arrived at my doorstep with no return address. Inside was a single newspaper clipping, detailing a missing person case from the neighboring town. Scribbled on the edge was a note in Joe's handwriting: "Curiosity has consequences." I threw the clipping away, but the message was clear. He was watching me, and he knew he'd gotten away with it. I don't know what to do now, trapped in this silent battle, terrified of what he might do if I ever try to expose him. I was an ordinary guy with a routine that spiraled into chaos. My friends always joked about how I had no concept of time management. I'd start a project, get distracted, and then panic the night before it was due, pulling all-nighters fueled by energy drinks. If I had a dime for every time I dreaded the school day that followed the midnight sprint, I would have a hefty bank account. But then everything changed one fateful morning. It started when I stumbled across an obscure website that boasted about a secret to time management. It promised crazy results, saying if you followed their method, you would gain control over every minute of your life. Intrigued and desperate for change, I dove deep into their rabbit hole. The site had a series of seemingly high-tech techniques. One approach that caught my attention was called the zero-point system. It claimed to harness the subconscious mind to bend time. Odd, right? But I was willing to try anything. I printed off the guidelines and began to implement them with religious zeal. The first step was as simple as it was bizarre: set an alarm clock for bizarre hours throughout the night. 3 a.m., 5 a.m., 7 a.m., you name it. I'd wake up, sit in the dark, and meditate for a few minutes about killing procrastination. Everything about this felt strange, and I wasn't sure it was working. But then, 2 weeks in, my grades started to improve. I finished assignments ahead of time, felt like I had more energy, and time seemed to extend around me. I was elated. I began to think of myself as a time management guru. My friends noticed I was less stressed, and my teachers praised my newfound diligence. It seemed silly how much progress I was making, but I didn't stop there. I decided to push the limits of the system. Over the next few weeks, I adjusted my sleep and alarm settings to wake up at the oddest hours constantly. I didn't want to miss a moment. Surprisingly, my social life took a hit. I was too focused on conquering my time to meet up with friends. The isolation started to gnaw at me, but I shrugged it off. I just wanted my life to run smoothly. Then, I began to notice something off. Sometimes when I woke up during the night, shadows flickered against the walls, almost as if they were alive. I initially brushed it off as fatigue-induced hallucinations. But the more alarms I set, the more pronounced those shadows became. I even considered abandoning the entire zero-point system, but my evolving obsession drowned out that hesitancy. I wanted to believe I was on the path to mastery, so I dove deeper into the routine. One morning, as my alarm blared at 3 a.m., I sat, eyes closed, focusing on procrastination. It felt different that night. I opened my eyes, and the room seemed darker, almost suffocating. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed a figure lurking in the corner, a shapeless mass that absorbed the light around it. Panic overtook me, and I fumbled to turn on the light, and just like that, it was gone. I shook it off, blaming sleep deprivation. The weeks wore on, the figures returned each time I woke in the wee hours. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were growing more defined, more aggressive, like they'd started to feed off my energy rather than merely observe. I grew increasingly strained. My friends, once understanding, began to voice their concerns over my absence. I promised them I'd make it up to them once I had my life under control. I was convinced that with just a bit more time management, I could balance my academics and social life again. But the shadows seemed to mock me. They followed me, whispering all the things I feared, that I was destined to be alone, that my newfound success was illusory, all while the alarms ticked closer to midnight, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. Before I knew it, I was at a crossroads. I had the success I'd dreamed of, but the price was high. I decided to attend a party on the night I usually told myself to stay up on time. I thought it would be good to have some normalcy, one last hurrah before diving back into the fray. That night, instead of the dark shadows, I found genuine laughter and connection. I let myself breathe again. But just as my heart felt at home, the alcohol blurred the edges, and the familiar chimes of my alarm crept into my mind, demanding attention. I pushed my phone away, hoping that perhaps for just one night, I could forget about the 0-point system. In doing so, I went to sleep that night with lights still on, falling into a slumber that I hadn't truly indulged in weeks. I awoke, disoriented, to the sound of hushed whispers rather than alarms. The shadows were there again, and this time they were furious. They surrounded my bed, an army of darkness bearing down. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air turned ice cold, and I felt them pulling at my soul, an attempt to drag me back into their black hole of despair. In that moment, I understood, it wasn't my time management I was failing at, it was being controlled by the promises of the void. With an uncommon surge of strength, I broke free from the grip of paralysis and jumped from the bed, screaming at the figures to leave me alone. To my shock, as I yelled at the darkness, it began to recede, flickering back into nothingness. But the moment brought its own realization. The anxiety, the compulsion to manage every second, had drawn this curse to me all along. I learned that real-time management wasn't about squeezing every second into productivity but rather finding the balance between commitments and personal connections. I had to reclaim my life from those shadows. The days that followed were a struggle, full of late-night confessions with friends and rebuilding connections, but slowly I found success in life again, one imperfect moment at a time. I buried the 0-point system, letting its vague promises fade into my past. I learned to embrace the chaos, understanding that time, in its infinite flow, would always be challenging. Sure, some shadows lingered, singing their siren songs, but now they were just echoes. I'm not saying I conquered time management, I still have my struggles. But I learned to separate productivity from my soul, and in doing so, I reclaimed the joy of living, free from the chains that once bound me. I've always been terrified of cooking. Growing up, my family had a weird obsession with perfect meals, and the kitchen was a battleground. Every time I entered, it felt like stepping onto a war-torn field. My mother would scream if the sauce wasn't simmering on just perfect, and my father would toss out ingredients like a chef auditioning for a cooking show. It left me with a deep-seated fear of the kitchen that stuck with me into adulthood. But recently, something gnawed at me. Was I really going to let this fear define my life? So, I signed up for a local cooking class. The brochure had vibrant pictures of seasoned chefs and laughing students, and as I filled out the registration form, I felt a mix of dread and excitement. The class met every Thursday night in the back of a little bistro named La Petite Cuisine. The first week came solely with nerves. I arrived to find an eclectic mix of people, young, old, and everything in between. The instructor, a man named Jacques, was French, of course, who oozed charisma and confidence as he introduced himself. The moment he spoke, the room erupted in laughter. Meals were made to bring joy, he said, not fear. I wanted to believe him. We began with something simple, chopping vegetables. Jacques demonstrated how to slice onions, and then he stepped aside, letting us try our hands at it. I panicked. The knife felt foreign in my hand, slipping awkwardly against the surface. The laughter around me grew as my onions became a pile of uneven chunks. The fear began to bubble up, old memories crept in, my mother's disappointed sigh echoing in my mind. But then I saw a woman across from me, a smile on her face as she expertly diced her onions. I focused on her, pushing my insecurities aside. I made it through the chopping class, and somehow, it wasn't nearly as catastrophic as I expected. I even managed to sauté the vegetables without setting anything on fire, which I deemed a small victory. But then the second week hit, and we were to make sauces from scratch. I had thought the first week would be the hardest, but as we gathered around the stoves, my heart raced. Jacques explained how a good sauce is the soul of a dish, but all I could think was how I had likely just dug my own grave. My hands shook as I whisked a bechamel sauce, the hot liquid reminding me of all the times I had burned my hands as a kid. Each stir felt like a betrayal. Would it end up lumpy, or worse, split before my eyes? Halfway through, the door swung open, and a dark figure stepped in. The atmosphere shifted instantly. I locked eyes with Jacques, and his usually welcoming demeanor faded slightly. The newcomer was an older man, dressed in a long black coat and a beanie pulled low over his eyes. He ambled towards our station without saying a word. We continued to whisk, but the room was heavy with an unspoken tension. The stranger stopped at my side, and I felt the hairs on my neck stand up as he leaned in and whispered, "You shouldn't be in here." At first, I thought I misheard him. Jacques glanced over, sensing the disturbance. The stranger simply crossed his arms, watching me with a strange intensity. Trying to brush it off, I focused on the sauce, but my hands began to tremble again. Murmurs broke out among my classmates, eyes darting toward the stranger, wondering who he was. Jacques, ever the professional, cleared his throat. "This is a cooking class, my friend. Everyone is welcome. We're just here to learn." But the man only scoffed. "You think this is just cooking?" Despite my fear, the rebuke cracked something in me, and I hardly knew where the words came from, but I snapped back, "Obviously, it is." "No," he said, his voice low and dripping with condescension. "This isn't just cooking. You're playing with fire." I felt my heart drop, and the laughter I'd felt previously vanished. Jacques moved closer, but before he could utter anything, the stranger continued to stare directly at me. "You're afraid, aren't you?" At that instant, something strange happened. The room warped, and I was back in my childhood kitchen, eyes darting to my mother's fiery gaze whenever I dropped something. I could hear pots clanging and the smell of smoke rose as I dashed for safety. I shook my head, trying to break free from the memory. The sauce in my pan was beginning to bubble over, ruining everything. Panic surged through me as I whipped back around to the stranger, now inches from my face. "You're gonna fail. You know that, right?" At that moment, the temperature dropped, and goosebumps crawled up my arms. Before I could respond, Jacques smirked, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Listen, everyone here has struggled with cooking at one point or another. It's part of the process." But all I could focus on was the stranger's piercing gaze. "What do you know?" I managed to say, though my voice trembled. The class resumed around me. Jacques started narrating steps for our upcoming dish while the stranger continued to loom beside me, his presence like a shadow. The sauce wafted an unsettling scent, as if it absorbed the negativity around me. My heart raced as I grabbed the whisk again, determined to prove him wrong. But as the class progressed, the stranger's whispers began to echo in my head. "You can't escape this. You'll always be afraid." I started to falter, the fear gripping me tighter, and every whisk felt wrong. Then, a fateful moment arrived. I had to add in an ingredient that required precision to achieve the right flavor. My hands shook as I paused over the bowl. The pan started bubbling ominously. It was as if a storm brewed on the stovetop, creeping closer. "Do it," the stranger hissed, his breath cold against my ear. "You're teetering on failure." I closed my eyes. The kitchen whirled around me, and without thinking, I poured in an entire cup instead of a tablespoon. The bubbling erupted violently. My sauce splattered all over the flaring stovetop, and before I fully registered what was happening, the flames danced up like a hungry beast. Instinct kicked in, and I screamed. "Fire!" Chaos erupted as everyone scrambled. Jacques grabbed the fire extinguisher, while the stranger merely stood there, an amused grin spreading across his face. The flames hissed and sputtered out under Jacques' control, but the aftermath lingered in the room like an unwelcome guest. My confidence shattered, and I stared numbly at the charred remains of what had once been a simple bechamel sauce. My heart sank. I was consumed by embarrassment. Everyone had just witnessed my failure. The stranger stepped closer, chuckling softly. "See? I told you. You should have listened." And then he casually walked away, leaving me with the remnants of my catastrophe. The rest of the class resumed despite the havoc, each my peers attempting to encourage my spirits. "Don't worry," one woman said, her tone soft. "We all mess up." But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. What had just happened felt darker than an ordinary cooking disaster. There was something surreal about that stranger. After class ended, I felt exhausted, frazzled, my fear reignited like embers from the flames. I rushed home, the stranger's laugh trailing behind me. It haunted my thoughts for days. I debated quitting the class altogether, but a flicker of determination ignited within me. I refused to be haunted by an incident. When the next week came around, I braced myself. The class was buzzing, filled with chatter, but every shadow still felt like it was watching. This time, as I entered, I half expected that man to be waiting. But he never showed. The feeling of relief washed over me, and perhaps, I really could find the courage to cook. That night, we tackled desserts, a lemon tart. The fear was still there, lurking like a specter, but as Jacques smiled and guided us through each step, I found my footing. I took my time, measuring and whisking and pouring my heart into the dish, focusing on the process instead of the stranger's chilling words. A sense of accomplishment bloomed when I pulled my tart out of the oven, golden and perfect. The class applauded, and I could finally breathe. The fear dissipated, replaced by a warm sense of satisfaction. But somehow, I still felt like there was something I hadn't shaken off from that night of the fire. Weeks passed, and I improved despite my lingering unease, but then came the final class. Jacques announced we would be cooking our pick of the meals we'd learned throughout the course, an opportunity to showcase our growth. Everyone around me radiated an excited energy, but a dark cloud settled in the back of my head. As I prepped the ingredients for a coq au vin, I felt someone watching me. I dared to glance over my shoulder, and there he was, lurking near the entrance with that same ominous grin. The fear gripped me, but as I returned to my work, I redirected it into focus. I couldn't let him ruin this for me. I poured every ounce of energy into the dish. I sautéed the onions, browned the chicken, and created the sauce to pair with it all. Time seemed to fly, and before long, the moment came for tasting. As I plated my coq au vin, built like art, I began to feel proud. The flavors blended, and it smelled divine. I tasted it before the class could, sighing in relief, it was fantastic. The moment Jacques began serving the dishes, I felt a rush of exhilaration. The class was full of compliments, and I reveled in the joy that emanated, until I noticed that stranger watching me from the corner of my eye. I tried to ignore him and focus on my classmates who enjoyed my dish. Their laughter and satisfaction echoed, slowly dimming the dark reality of the stranger creeping up on me. But I felt him drawing closer, a chilly aura making me shudder. As everybody shared their triumphs, I caught his unsettling eyes gazing at me. "It's just cooking," I muttered defiantly, breaking the tension I'd felt all night. "You think it's just cooking?" He spat back. Jacques glanced between us, foreboding swirling in the air. "It's more than a meal, it's passion." I shot him a glare. "I said you don't belong here. You're just a distraction." My classmates fell silent, surprise hanging in the air, and the stranger's expression morphed, revealing anger I'd not seen before. But then something shifted. As I claimed my space, something indefinable settled over me, defiance surged. "I have overcome this fear. I choose to cook. You don't control me anymore." The fire in my voice lit up the room as if I emerged triumphantly from within my own shadows. The stranger's eyes twitched, maybe even wavering, and then he took a step back, his smug expression faltering. "You think you've beaten me? You don't even know what I am." I felt my classmates stirring with anxiety, but I refused to back down. "I'm not scared of you. Not anymore. You're just a memory, not my future." My heart raced, and suddenly, his presence felt thinner, evaporating into the hum of laughter and warmth that overcame the group. Jacques stepped forward with calm, securing my newfound strength. "See. You've conquered your fear." The stranger turned, and I watched him fade away, back towards the door, disappearing into nothingness. Relief washed over me, and my classmates cheered. That night, I discovered more than just cooking. I realized the ghosts of fear could be vanquished if I dared to stand my ground. Fear is a fire that can burn, but it can also be a forge to build strength, resilience, and passion. Cooking was never just the food, it was my way of carving out a new future, and every bite tasted sweeter for it. I walked out of La Petite Cuisine knowing I would never be afraid of the kitchen again. That stranger, my fear, was finally vanquished, and I had won my battle through the culinary arts. I never considered myself a strong person. In fact, I often felt like I was floating through life, always just on the periphery of everything, never really engaged. But that changed one night when I decided to take a hiking trip in the local woods, a place I'd grown up near but never truly explored. I thought it might be a fun escape from my monotonous routine. The woods were dense, ancient trees twisting together in a way that felt like a living labyrinth, whispering secrets I wasn't privy to. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and I decided to push further onto a path that felt too enchanting to abandon. After an hour of wandering, I stumbled upon an old cabin, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss, as if it had been swallowed by the forest. Something about it pulled me in, a mix of curiosity and foolish bravery compelling me to explore its dark interior. I stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of decaying wood. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. As I stepped deeper into the cabin, I noticed strange carvings on the walls, symbols and hieroglyphs that seemed to shift in the dim light. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a rustle coming from the far corner of the room. Panic surged as I turned, half expecting to see a wild animal or a lost hiker, but what I saw chilled me to the bone. A figure, tall and shadowy, emerged from the darkness. Its features were indistinct, cloaked in shadows. Fear gripped my heart, but instead of running, I felt an inexplicable urge to confront whatever this was. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice echoing in the stillness. The figure raised its hand, pointing to the symbols on the wall. Then, to my shock, it spoke, though its voice was a mere whisper that felt both distant and near. "You seek strength, yet you are lost. To find it, you must face your fears." Just then, the ground shook, and the cabin lurched around me. The shadows deepened. I was suddenly standing at the edge of a vast abyss, the cabin nowhere to be seen. I felt a crushing weight of isolation. My heart raced. I had to decide, would I jump into the unknown, or turn back, spiral again into the safety of ignorance? It was the first challenge. The silence around me was deafening, each moment stretching into infinity. I thought about my life, the self-doubt, the loneliness, the constant feeling of insignificance, and I realized that jumping into the void represented my deepest fears, my failures, the myriad reasons I felt weak. My heart pounded in my chest, but something else burned within me too, an ember of determination. I took a step toward the edge of the abyss, and my breath hitched in my throat. I edged closer, the unknown calling to me in a way I never anticipated. In that moment, I leapt, feeling the rush of air around me as I fell. But instead of plummeting into darkness, I began to rise. As I ascended, the air filled with colors, vivid reds and blues and greens, transforming the abyss into a breathtaking expanse of light. I was no longer afraid. I realized that embracing challenges head-on was my strength. I found myself soaring through this kaleidoscope, feeling freer than ever before. But the journey didn't stop there. I was set upon new trials, each infused with lessons that rang true. In one, I faced a storm, the skies turned dark, and winds howled. I stood my ground, feeling the power of resilience surge within me as I embraced the chaos. In another, I encountered a raging river, swift and treacherous, blocking my way. I had to find the courage to swim against the current, a task that left me breathless and exhausted, but I emerged victorious on the other side, every stroke strengthening my resolve. With each challenge conquered, I felt pieces of myself coming together, fitting into place like a puzzle I never knew existed. I realized that my strength wasn't in physical prowess but in my ability to confront fear, to embrace discomfort, and to push through obstacles. After what felt like a lifetime of trials, a final challenge awaited me, a mirror reflecting my deepest self. In its depths, I saw my insecurities, my failures, but also my potential, my growth, and all the battles I had fought. It was both haunting and liberating. As I gazed into the mirror, I understood that every hardship, every moment of doubt, had forged my identity, crafting a strength I would carry with me. In that instant, the shadowy figure returned, a faint smile on its featureless face. "You've learned well," it whispered. With those words, the mirror shattered, and I felt myself being pulled back into the woods. The cabin had vanished, leaving me standing alone among the trees as dawn broke, casting light through the leaves. My heart raced with the aftershocks of my journey. What had felt like an ordinary hike had transformed into a rite of passage. In conquering the unknown, I had awakened a strength I never knew existed, and the world around me seemed brighter, more vivid than ever before. I walked back, but now each step was a reminder of the empowerment I found in the face of fear. The ancient woods, with all their shadows and secrets, had led me to the most significant realization of my life, that strength isn't a physical attribute but a mental surge, a determination to rise through challenges. I left the woods that day forever changed, transformed by an experience rooted in both terror and triumph. I entered that cabin a lost soul, but I emerged with clarity, a tangible recognition of my potential. It's easy to dismiss fears as weaknesses, to retreat into our shells, but I now know that each challenge brings us closer to who we are meant to be. So, if you ever find yourself in the woods, lurking near shadows and echoes, remember, it is through the trials we face that we discover our true strengths. The journey is yours to take, embrace it, and you may find yourself soaring beyond your wildest dreams. When I discovered my partner's hidden talent, a surprise. When I discovered my partner's hidden talent, a surprise was one of those moments you only read about in books or see in movies, the kind of thing you never actually think will happen to you. My partner, Ben, had always been quiet and somewhat reserved, the type of person who preferred to stay in the background at parties, content to listen rather than talk, and while he was a kind, funny, and incredibly supportive partner, he'd never given me any reason to think he was hiding something extraordinary. We'd been together for 3 years, living in a small, cozy apartment that suited us just fine, a life filled with routines that were comfortable and predictable, which was exactly how I thought we both liked it. Ben was an accountant by day, a creature of habit who'd rather spend an evening watching reruns of sitcoms on the couch than going out on some wild adventure. So, imagine my shock when, during a casual evening at home, I stumbled upon something that turned my entire understanding of him upside down. It happened completely by accident. I was cleaning out the closet while he was out running errands, looking for an old photo album I hadn't seen in a while, when my hand brushed against a dusty, nondescript box tucked away in the far corner. It was one of those old wooden boxes with intricate carvings on the lid, something that looked too old to belong to Ben, who I'd never known to have a sentimental attachment to anything other than his favorite coffee mug. Curious, I pulled it out, wiping away years of dust, and pried it open, half expecting to find some forgotten trinket or maybe an old journal. Instead, what I found left me speechless. Inside was a small stack of photographs, not of Ben or his family but of stunningly realistic paintings, each one more breathtaking than the last. They were of landscapes, cities, people, some smiling, some looking wistful, each one imbued with a life and emotion that seemed to leap off the paper. I thought at first that maybe he'd bought these or collected them somehow, but something about the way the box was hidden, the careful way they were arranged, told me these paintings were more than just a collection. Beneath the photographs was a small sketchbook, the pages filled with quick, meticulous sketches of everything from animals to bustling city streets, each one done with such precision that it was like peering into a frozen moment in time. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, and that's when I saw it, a small, folded note tucked into the back of the box, with the words to remember scrawled across the front in Ben's familiar handwriting. My heart pounded as I unfolded it, feeling as though I was intruding on something deeply personal, but my curiosity had completely taken over. The note was short, barely more than a few lines, but it hit me like a punch. It read, "To remember who I was before I became who I am. To remember the part of me I had to leave behind." I sat there, staring at the note, feeling a strange mixture of confusion and awe. Who was this person I'd been living with for 3 years, and what was this hidden life he'd left behind? That evening, when Ben returned home, I couldn't keep it to myself. I held up the box, feeling my hands shake slightly, and asked him point blank, "Ben, what is this?" He froze, his face draining of color as he looked from the box to me, a flicker of something unrecognizable in his eyes. For a moment, he looked like he was about to deny everything, but then he let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair, and sat down on the edge of the bed, motioning for me to join him. What he told me was a story I could have never expected. As it turned out, before he met me, before he settled into the life I thought was all he'd ever known, Ben had been an artist, a serious, passionate artist who had once dreamed of making a living from his paintings. He'd spent years studying, honing his skills, pouring everything he had into his art, and for a while, he'd even been on the verge of his big break. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Just as he was gaining recognition, he'd been hit with a series of personal setbacks, family issues, financial troubles, things that had pulled him away from his dream, forcing him to find a stable job, to grow up and leave his art behind. He kept it hidden, he said, because he didn't want me to see him as a failure, as someone who'd given up on his dreams, and he didn't want to open that part of himself again. But now, as he spoke, I could see something in his eyes, a spark, a flicker of the passion he'd buried for so long, and I felt a swell of something indescribable, a mix of love, admiration, and a strange sadness for the person he'd been and the dreams he'd left behind. After that night, something shifted between us. I encouraged him, gently, to pick up a paintbrush again, to try creating just for himself, no pressure, no expectations. At first, he resisted, claiming he was too rusty, that he'd lost whatever talent he once had, but I could see the way his fingers itched whenever he looked at a blank canvas. So, one day, I surprised him with a set of paints and brushes, leaving them on the kitchen table with a note that simply said, "For the artist in you." It took a few days, but one evening, I came home to find him sitting at the table, paintbrush in hand, a half-finished landscape spread out before him. He looked up at me, his face a mixture of nerves and excitement, and I knew in that moment that the person I'd known for 3 years was just one part of him, and now I was meeting another, deeper part that he'd hidden away. Over the next few weeks, he began to paint more and more, each canvas revealing a different piece of his soul, a side of him I'd never seen. The more he painted, the more he opened up, telling me stories of his past, of the years he'd spent chasing his dream, of the sacrifices he'd made, the things he'd lost along the way. Watching him rediscover his talent was like witnessing a transformation, a rebirth of sorts, and I felt honored to be a part of it, to see him come alive in a way I'd never seen before. Eventually, he started sharing his work online, hesitant at first, but as the positive feedback poured in, I saw his confidence grow, that old spark reignited, brighter than ever. One night, he showed me a message from an art gallery interested in his work, and the look on his face was one of pure disbelief, like he couldn't quite accept that his talent, his passion, had found its way back into his life. That night, as we celebrated with a bottle of wine and talked about the future, I realized that our relationship had deepened in a way I'd never thought possible. I hadn't just discovered his hidden talent, I'd uncovered a part of his soul, a piece of him he'd kept locked away, and in doing so, I felt like I'd fallen in love with him all over again, this time with a new understanding, a new appreciation for the person he truly was, both the man I'd known and the artist he'd become once more.